This is an interview conducted by Dale Anderson with Alan Ramsden on December the 15th, 1993. Alan, could you maybe just give us a little bit of personal background, when you were born and where and
Sure.
stuff like that?
Yeah, I was born in Nelson in April 14th, 1926. My father was an Englishman who came out with his family determinedly about 1911 or 12. Two of his older brothers had come out about 1904 or 5 and had been around for a bit by then. Father was called back to his regiment in England when the war broke out in 1914. And after one sally over to France, got shot in the foot and was demobbed, as they said.
Right.
And so he came back to Canada. And by 1915-16, they were organizing a new battalion, the 225th in Nelson. And he, while he couldn't have gone overseas, he was picked up because of his military training and became a staff sergeant with the 225th. And one of the recruits in the 225th was John O'Malley, who was slightly underage and who was my mother's brother. And so he sort of took John under his wing, and they were sent off to camp at Vernon and then down to New Westminster. My mother's father, who had come up from the United States, one of the O'Malley clan, disappeared around 1907, when my mother had been born in 1906, 1907, 1908, took off for the coast, and one of those various quote gold rushes to the Yukon and the Alaska, and he apparently went off to seek his wealth. He's like the fellow that went out to buy a cigar and never came back. And anyway, my grandmother O'Malley died in 1914, left my mother and their two sisters and her brother John at home. And the girls were sent off to an orphanage in New Westminster. Well, when John went into the Army, my father arranged to have my mother, who was the youngest of the three girls, come back to Nelson and live with his family during the war. And so sometime in the 1920s, my mother was attending the St. Joseph's Nursing School in Seattle. And my father went down and courted her and persuaded her to marry him, and they came back to Nelson and settled down. And that's sort of the background of it.
Right.
So I've sort of had an interest in history, I suppose, because my father had a few of these little artifacts that he collected as a boy over in England. A little piece of Roman tile from a Roman bath, one or two things like this. At the same time, a number of his friends were involved in the Russian lumber business in Nelson. A.H. Green, I remember visiting with him a lot, and he was a contractor, and built a large lumber remanufacturing business on the waterfront. The building is still there, that Art Deco building on the corner of Front and Wall Street.
When would that have been?
That was in the 33, 34, somewhere in that period. It was designed by Mr. Williams, the local architect of considerable fame. He designed the Civic Center, Medical Services Clinic, and a great many homes, including the one that's across the alley from us here, was one of his designs. He was acclaimed as a world-renowned architect. In 1939, he designed the Canadian Pavilion at the World's Fair. So he brought with him a lot of expertise. However, as a result of A.H. Green and my father's interest, he also was a good friend of John Burns, who ran the Hot Springs Hotel and Resort at Ainsworth, and they were in the lumbering business. So, and then the Lambert family were also family friends, personal friends of my father's going back to when he first came out from the old country. He was involved in the Sons of England organization here, and they were all involved in that also. So that that's how I sort of got a little connection with an interest in the woods and the lumber and what it could do. I just catch this beaver did.
Alan, so some of your earliest recollections then were, of course, of the Nelson area and the forests. Now, your connection, as I understand it, both, in a working sense and a recreational sense, which came first?
Well, I guess the recreational part of it, because from when I guess we were youngsters were able to walk more than 2 or 3 blocks. As soon as we were able to walk a substantial distance, we lived up the hill at the corner of Houston and Ward, and so we were about 2.5 blocks from the Great Northern Tracks, which was a great place to walk, because in those days the train ran only twice a day, once in and once out, and the track itself was not a highly ballasted rock-filled thing. It was wooden ties, mostly untreated, lying in a bed of rock, but mostly with dirt piled in between. So it was a very pleasant place to walk. You could walk and you can get tar on your shoes or any of the things that bother people who walk on railway tracks these days. So it was a really nice place to walk, and we used to walk out south as far as the Salmo Creek. In those days it was called Smith Creek, and it was sort of a nice Sunday afternoon walk or that. Or if we were going on a little picnic and didn't want to go down to Lakeside Park, which meant catching the streetcar or whatever, we would walk down over the hill by the cemetery into what was then known as the rifle range. Development that later became called Cottonwood City. And of course at that time the rifle range was still in place, though unused, because there were a number of squatters along here, but most of it was a big open area.
I was going to ask the types of forests that you have been walking through back in...
Well, when I was growing up, we lived uphill, and there were a lot of vacant lots. And I don't really remember on any of those vacant lots seeing remnants of burnt trees at that particular point. But I also realized that a lot of that area up there was covered with either jack pine, which would have been cut and used for firewood by anybody around there. There were very few trees, except on one section on the corner, well, about the best part of a full half block on Richard Street. There were probably 40 or 50 large fir and trees on it. And when that was finally developed in the 50s, those were all cut down and turned into firewood. But that area was about the only place where I remember large fir trees being around. On our own house up the hill, there were about 8 or 10 maple trees. We lived in a corner lot, and they were down the front and up the side of it on Ward Street. But over towards Cottonwood Creek Canyon at that time, the area was mostly covered with poplar. Well, a lot of poplar when I was a kid, and a fair amount of white pine, still surviving at that time.
Sure.
And we used to. Nobody worried, concerned themselves if we kids made our own log buildings or anything out of poplar,
Right.
because it wasn't a very good wood for firewood, and there was growing like weeds. So we learned our initial woodsmanship, cutting down poplar trees and shaping them up into little, usually not 4-sided buildings, but usually 2-sided buildings, frames like, so we had some sort of place to pile branches over and make a cover.
Right.
And later when we got into Boy Scouts, then we got a little more sophisticated and we made real bivouacs.
Sure.
But that kind of wood was readily available almost all over. There was a lot of cherry, wild cherry up the hill at that time, and there doesn't seem to be any around anymore. There was a lot of local birch, the interior birch, which in some places grows to a fair size, but it grows very quickly. So that was around a lot. And of course, as soon as you got towards Great Northern Tracks, then there was what same sort of woods you see today. So pine, fir, hemlock, cedar. Right. One of the things I remember very early was the excitement we had when we would find something unique, like a odd Engelmann spruce that had popped up at the lower elevations. It was quite different to find something like that. Yeah. Or to find one of their two other treasures, like the yew tree. They were quite unusual in this area where I grew up. There were lots of large cottonwoods still around. Of course, Lakeside Park had a lot of them.
It must have been more colorful in the summer and fall then.
Oh yes,
More conifers now than.
The burned area, which is behind the golf course, which most people now wouldn't recognize as a burned area, but all the time I was growing up, it was a totally burned area. And of course, early on, the jack pine came into it a little bit, and a lot of larch. And of course, every fall it was just a great golden patch.
Oh, sure.
And so you sort of remember those images, I think. And then once I was 10 or 11, and we were hiking up onto the tops and into the alpine areas, of course, then a whole new range of experiences and interest in some firs and the for living smaller, scrubby.
Would be in the area just east of Nelson.
Well, we used to our favorite place to go for overnight or something like that, and you reach fairly quickly, was to go up the back behind Nelson. There was a good fire trail. 1934-35, they had a couple of fires out by Apex that went east, and they cut a trail by the Great Northern Station across what was Magnio's clearing farm, where they had a dairy farm and cleared land so they could graze cows. Went through that and then zigzagged up along the edge of Ward Creek Canyon as it went up the hill, and then cut across the top. That's the first time I really remember when you cut across the top. They went through old growth, and reminded me of being taken to Vancouver as a child and seeing the big trees in Stanley Park, and suddenly realized, hey, we had some pretty big trees here too. Right. It may not have been 9 feet in diameter, but they were 4 or 5 feet in diameter, 80, 90, 100 feet high. But they seem to be all, at that upper part, seem to be all Douglas fir. I don't remember thinking too much about hemlock at that time. It seemed to me that coming back from Nelson, it was almost all pine on the way up into Douglas fir, and then on the hillsides, some of the mountain firs and fir, stuff like that we could find. When I got into Boy Scouts, and we often would go to our scout meeting in the old scout hall, and our scoutmaster would say, well, we're going to do a test or something tonight. We'd hike from there over Jarrow Park all the way over the back, and we'd come out over Anderson Creek. And Anderson Creek, there was quite a bit of hemlock in there, so it was really big when I first became familiar with hemlock and what it was like. That sort of triggered, I guess, a lot of interest in a whole variety of shrubs and trees. It was part of Boy Scouts and that sort of thing.
The main attraction is to kids to go hiking back up.
Oh, I guess
Scenery,
anybody that's ever can remember the first time they came upon alpine, I think it just bites you. Yeah. There's nothing like it. There's a sense of freedom. And I think when you're 12, 13, wow, the adventure, the whole romantic. And I don't think romantic in terms of thinking of Davy Crockett or something, but I think as a that age, you seem to have a romantic spirit.
Were you packing air rifles or something like that?
Well, by then we were all packing 22s, illegally, I guess. You weren't supposed to carry a gun without an adult until you were 14 in those days. But everybody had firearms, and nobody was shooting anybody. So, you know, that was never an issue.
No.
And there wasn't any of us that weren't, I would say, very strictly taught how to handle them. So no one ever worried that we were taking a 22 off, and mostly the reason for taking one was the hope of getting a blue grouse or two when we were in the upper levels, which we quite often did. It was just the opportunity to get up onto that skyline and to be free, you know, and independent.
Did you walk the ridges?
Well, yeah, where we could. Unfortunately, if you go up here and you get on the only real ridge you can walk is around and down to Apex. You come out on the ridge, and we did that quite often. The other adventures that I enjoyed really were the Gormley family, who had been in the mining business in this area for quite a long time. Moved in after the crash in 1930-31. They'd been up at Three Forks, and everything that they had up there just disappeared. And they came to town, and they bought two houses down on about a half block on Houston Street from us. And one of the boys was my age. The rest of them were quite a bit older. There were some girls around my age, but one of the boys was my age. And they took a lease on the Venus and Juno properties in particular. And one of the boys worked for other people who were leasing the Athabasca. And so on Friday evenings from about, I guess, May through till the end of October, one of the favorite things to do during school weeks was to take off after school on Friday and hike up to the mine, spend the weekend up there, and come back down Sunday night so we could be in school on Monday. And when we were up there, of course, we got on the Bird's Eye and we hiked around to the top of the Silver King and all the way back around to Hall Creek and that, take advantage of that country.
That's pretty significant hiking, I would think.
Yeah, well, when I think about it now, we'd probably been in grade 5 or 6, and we'd head home at 3:30 after school, get up the hill. We lived about 12, 14 blocks up from the central school, and my mother would have packed a lunch and whatever else she thought I might need for the weekend, and I had a little knapsack, and I'd walk down the street and pick up my friend Les, and off we would go, heading for the mine. And it would be, getting pretty dusk in the early part of the year, or in October. In fact, lots of times we walked in the dark in the last mile or two.
Yeah.
And I can remember on a couple of occasions, there was a cougar hung around in that area. I think used to hunt down in Give Up Creek mostly. But we used to hear him occasionally, and I'm sure he knew we were around because we'd hear this mewling sound, which we originally thought must be a cat. What would a cat be doing up here? But definitely there. And then, of course, occasionally we'd see his tracks. But other than that, there didn't seem to be any large animals around. Over in the head of Hall Creek, there was always a grizzly bear too. We could always see him. We never seemed to have any trouble. If you got upwind of him, you could smell him very definitely. And so we got to know where he was hanging out. Or we'd listen, we're two boys hiking along. You'd pause every now and then, and you'd hear a few rocks being lifted off the side of the hill. You'd know that he was out there rooting around trying to find some rodents of one kind or another.
What about, I guess there weren't elk in the area at that time?
No, I think elk were, to my recollection, weren't an issue in this part of the world until well into the 50s. And then that was because they started bringing them into the Lardo.
Right. Did you see any moose when you were a kid?
Only when we traveled over to I remember seeing Rocky Mountain goat,
In this area?
well up by Kaslo,
Okay.
and mostly mule deer. And in the wintertime, it was the only time really we ever saw white-tailed deer. I think the white-tailed deer saw us and managed to avoid us. Mule deer, you'd see them all the time. And particularly around the mine or that, they would wander right down to find salt. And nobody chased them or went after them. And we never had a dog with us, so deer were very, very friendly.
Did you ever graduate to big game hunting then?
Well, not
Later
until I, yeah, we did, I guess by the time I was 18, hunting a few times, not with any great success. I think I've only killed 2 deer in my life, two of them down in the Salmo area. Shot a black bear once. Only because he was attacking the building, the intent on getting some of the, there was a mine up above Hall Creek, and they had left a large amount of sacked horse feed. And the bear, for some reason, must have got a taste of that and decided he liked it. And we were up there one weekend and around that area, and came back, and he had torn the door off the lean-to shed and was in there, and we everything we could to scare him off. He kept coming back, and so we eventually shot him. But other than that, I don't think lots of ducks and lots of ducks down in the Tagum area, and grouse wherever they were. You know.
Was hunting a popular pastime in the area?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think bird hunting, and in every fall there were lots of people in the area where I lived who depended on a couple of deer that they would get every fall. And I mean, they went hunting. Some of them, if they were railroaders, seemed to favor going down to Thai. I guess it served 2 purposes. They got transportation, didn't cost them anything, and they it was excellent. Other people went over to the Grand Forks area and would make an expedition for deer over there. And then, you know, people hunted Squirrel Creek, and that was one of the favorite places. Or down in the Salmo area, where there would seem to be a lot of deer.
Right.
You know, there were a lot of deer down in the Salmo area. I think probably still are.
Right, that could be connected with the Ponderay area, which
Yeah.
is quite a source for deer.
Yeah, I think, you know, over a period of time, we shot some odd things, I suppose, out of curiosity or whatever, and when it was possible to do that, and there were lots of critters around, so to speak. I remember once horrifying my mother by bringing home a dead weasel, needing to skin him out and hang him up in the woodshed, and of course, weasel's next thing to a skunk as far as odor goes, and I wasn't as aware of the procedures of handling an animal like that as I did. We were always warned of not to attempt to eat rabbits, so after shooting one and finding out we couldn't do anything really with it, we didn't ever bother pursuing rabbits.
That was because of tularemia? Rabbit?
Well, that's what we were told, yeah. But I dined on squirrel a number of times. But we were always, it was suggested to us that we always skin them and make sure they didn't show signs of tick bites and stuff like that. If the flesh looked like it was not been abused by some insect life or something, like we would probably decide that it was better business not to eat it.
Right.
Lots of fish, of course. All the creeks were full of small trout with big heads and small bodies.
Yes, Cottonwood Lake is an example, I suppose.
Yeah, Cottonwood Lake had a resident population of kamloops, rainbow trout as they were called. And they were differentiated enough in the minds of the game branch, wildlife, Dominion Fisheries, going backwards, who were responsible for inland fishery. They referred to them as mountain rainbow. And they saw an easy source of eggs at Cottonwood Lake, And recognizing that they were very undersized, they took those eggs and used them to plant hundreds of alpine lakes that had never had fish in them before.
Lakes such as Mill Lake?
Practically all the resident single population that's in small lakes and a lot of streams came from Cottonwood Lake stock. It wasn't until, I can't remember whether it was the 60s or 70s, somewhere in there, that they poisoned all those fish in that lake and put a different variety in there.
Do you recall their reasoning for doing
Well,
that?
I think that they were all getting rather bullheaded, and I think that what had happened was that after the fisheries people had managed to remove practically the total resident population by stripping the spawners, put back some fish, and the fish just didn't make a. Now they allow people to fish all year round there. They ice fishing in the winter, and I think they keep the population down, so the fish seem to be healthier. But,
when would they have first started stocking some of the higher lakes?
I think it was just after the First World War that government stocking started taking, 21 I think, somewhere in there, they began a program. And then in the early 20s, a fellow named Jimmy Robinson was the fish and game person here. And I think he worked under the Dominion Fisheries at that time. And they had a hatchery in Nelson, and they raised the eggs from egg deposited stage, which they picked up, to the eyed stage. Once they reached the eyed stage and they knew they were alive, then they would pack a 4-gallon can and packboard and head up into the hills.
Right.
Dump the eggs in either an inflowing stream that had a relatively even, hopefully gravelly, sandy entrance into the lake, or if that wasn't there, then they would put them in the mouth of where the lake flowed out. Hall Creek was a good example. The fish spawn at the outflow of Hall Creek in Lost Lake, so-called. Those lakes, the spawning population spawns in the outflow. And I think it also occurs in lakes like Kokanee Lake. See spawners in that. But you also see spawners in the up on the far end of Kokanee Lake, in that meadow area,
Right.
And fairly early in the fall. One of the first things I learned about hiking in Kokanee in those days was that if the fish weren't biting when you were going through Kokanee Lake, which was usually a place we fished as we walked along, sort of worked our way along, looking towards supper or lunch. At the far end, quite often you could reach under the bank and pull fish out.
Right.
And of course that always amazed people who'd never been in the woods before. And it doesn't always work very well. I mean, you had to be pretty sure of yourself if you wanted to show off. If it was with a bunch of guys you'd always hiked with while everybody was trying it, so we just try and be quiet along the bank and then just feel along, And because that stream was, more like a ditch, flowing cold water, I think the fish were not frightened off at all. Or the only place to get escape was a little undercut in the bank, and so if you reached in there, they were about to leave. I can remember getting 3 or 4 on one occasion that way.
Kokanee Glacier wouldn't have been a park at that time, I suppose.
Kokanee Glacier Park was declared about 1921 or 22. It was a result of the Kokanee Mountaineering Club, which became sort of fixated on Kokanee after they successfully had it turned into a park.
So this was before your time.
By the time I was growing up, I knew, though, there again was another, I suppose, reason for my interest in hiking. Aunts and uncles all belonged to the Kokanee Mountaineering Club and had pictures hanging around of them at the old Spokane Chief Cabin back in the early 20s. And so that was a determination that one of these days got to get up there,
Sure.
And also the talk about it. They originally started out, and their mountaineering was based on the Banff experience. So when they wanted to go mountaineering on the Kokanee, they hired an outfitter and a cook and so on, and they moved up there.
They did it
And they
in
just
style.
did day hiking, without packs or anything. The first time I went up to Kokanee was in 1946. And we hiked from the highway. We got a ride with a highways department truck we left our house a block from the streetcar, caught the first streetcar in the morning, 6:30, down to the end of it, which is about underneath where the bridge is now, and the ferry crossed there. The public works truck going out the lake, they dropped us off at the foot of, on the highway. And then we walked from there up to Gibson Lake the first day, then around the Slocan Chiefs the second day. And we spent a couple of days there, and then we hiked over the bank and down to the foot of the fork of Kaslo River, and then back up into the Joker Lakes, and spent 2 days up in the top end of Coffee Creek, staying in the old cabin up above the Joker Lakes, and then walked out all the way to Kaslo.
That's
So it was about an 8 day, I guess about 9 days, in summer of '46.
I don't know if you've seen.
Yeah, I've got some pictures I took in 1946, and there's quite a noticeable difference in where it is now. I guess it's a combination of not having the heavy wintry snows and cold that we used to experience. For me, about 33 or 34, and around in those years, and in that part of the 30s, 35, 36, and through there, we had a lot of snow. And of course, the lake was still tending to freeze over, not like it did. But once they built the Corlin Dam, we began to notice less and less freezing in the lake because they were holding back a lot of the flow. And of course, it was wider, and therefore, while the shores would be icy, the main snow wasn't so how, of course, with the Columbia River dams in place, warm water is continually coming into the lake from impoundment up above the main lake, and then they're holding the lake itself at a higher level, so that the volume of water in the whole thing is much higher in the time of year when we'd be normally getting cold.
Would you have had abnormal?
I remember, for instance, at least one year when the water was right up to the railway tracks at Lakeside Park. So it was over the lawns and that. The other thing that's a little misleading is that over the years they paved and overpaved and paved and overpaved that roadway from the tracks going down to the wharf where the boat launch was, but where originally the ferry crossed. So that began to build up. So water coming in would, by now, if it came on over that roadway, would probably be just half an inch thick. It wouldn't have been dramatic, but it was a film of water. And of course, as you progressed down towards the city wharf, then you could see the water was right up to the tracks all the way along. And it caused quite a bit of problem because there was a fair amount of activity on the waterfront at that time still.
In addition to the West Arm itself, I guess some of the creeks.
Oh yeah, well, Cottonwood Creek used to flood all over, and you could hear all over town. You could hear Cottonwood Falls roaring and all those small creeks. Anderson Creek used to break out of its channel all the time.
Oh, really?
And if you look at the papers in the 30s, you'll see stories of irate landowners and property owners in Fairview wanting to sue the city because they had waterworks up there, and they blamed that on on the meanderings of Anderson Creek. Anderson Creek, I guess, at one time flowed across this whole Fairview area, coming out at various points. Where it runs in now, what's left of it, down by Cougar, it was just gradually pushed into that channel, and that channel was created, didn't exist as a fixed location. I think at one time it may have very well, because it seems to have made a delta out of the whole of Fairview, actually.
That makes sense.
It was when they originally were settling here, and that it came out in the corner about along parallel where the greenhouses are at Lakeside Park, out down along the tracks through there. And it created these big gullies that, like where the Bevan apartments are, and the old brickyard was digging clay out of that area. It cut through there. There's another one over where the Esso station is now. That was a big gully that where it was going before they took it over to towards Cookie Forest and down 5th Street.
Okay.
This whole flat area down here, I guess, grew a great, huge amount of cottonwood logs. And I think cottonwood logs were all over the place, and they were not sought by any of the early pioneers because the cottonwood is a semi-hardwood, and it's very heavy. It tends to absorb water very readily. The bark is not particularly useful for any purpose. It doesn't make good temporary fires or hot fires if you need a little extra heat in something. And so, and it was attractive along the lake shores. So it was just sort of a nuisance wood. And the worst thing, I guess, for most people would be if it fell over, might do some damage.
Right.
So along the waterfront in front of Nelson, they got rid of most of them. They foresaw that as a problem.
Right.
But they were abundant on all the flats and all the water edges and that. And in the end of the 20s and early 30s, they decided they could make veneer out of cottonwood.
Oh, really?
And they established a veneer plant here in the 30s. And let's see, I don't suppose there's really anything there in that actual location. It's about where the streetcar turns around at that end, except that that's all fill. And so it's kind of hard to imagine what waterfront was like when I was a kid. But there was where the public works yard was part of land that the veneer plant was built on. And then they had a turf arrangement out into the lake, and then moving grounds in front of that. And they processed cottonwood logs and made beautiful veneer. If it'd been an enterprise they could have undertaken today, it would have made them a lot of money because cottonwood, while it comes out looking white, it has wonderful graining and can be stained to any kind of color that you would like. So it could have imitated any of the colors, and it has these beautiful patterns in it. And
they had an abundant supply close to hand.
Yeah.
At the time.
They were able to begin with logging around the lake.
Recall the name of the company?
Yeah, it was Nelson Veneer Works. Well, it was called BC Veneer Works, actually. Pardon me. It was BC Veneer Works.
Okay.
Yeah, and what happened when they finally ran out of a decent supply of cottonwood logs, and by then they were bringing them in by railway cars from as far away as Grand Forks and anywhere where the river bottoms where the large cottonwoods would grow, and which had never been touched until that time. Guys were quite willing to go out and saw them down and cut them into, I guess, whatever length they needed to make peelers out of. And they shipped them here, and they were able to offload them into the lake originally, and then wait for high water to pick them up so they could take them around to the green chain. But later on, they built a derrick, and they were able to just side dump them onto the off-railway cars onto the ground, and then they just lifted them around. They still put them in the water, but they were able to handle them that way instead of having to have them dumped on the bank.
What period of time were they operating?
Well, they operated. I'm just trying to remember whether that was still operating. The building was still there in the 50s. I don't just remember when they actually quit because of a shortage of logs. The fellow that ran it, a fellow named DeBortz, went north to Prince George, and I think he operated a veneer works up there. But they weren't working with cottonwood then; they were working with northern poplar. It doesn't, while it makes a decent piece of plywood perhaps, not strong like fir plywood, but furniture finish type plywood, or cheap underlay type of graded plywood. Poplar doesn't have that texture or graining that the harder cottonwood does. And of course, they're running with much smaller logs. A good poplar tree, well grown, and that might be 1.5 to 2 feet diameter.
Right.
Cottonwood log could be 3 or 4 feet in diameter.
Right.
So.
Cottonwoods from other parts of the.
Oh yeah, it was like they'd found a new mineral or something. It was an opportunity to convert something that was totally disused into a product.
Did they account then for a fair?
I think they just about stripped all the usable large. Cottonwood tends to, when it gets to a fairly large size, particularly interior softwoods, particularly deciduous ones, tend to rot out at the top and develop those kind of problems, or become hollow core. And so they become unstable, and of course people like at Lakeside Park, they finally took them down because they were worried about a limb falling off one of those trees, and you get a 3-ton limb come down, do some pretty horrendous damage. But yeah, I remember when, as a youngster, if you went up from Nelson, say, to Kaslo on the boat, every creek outlet had these huge cottonwoods. And I suppose today there would be a war on us if they want to take the cottonwoods, because they lend an exotic look to our landscape that our other trees don't.
Well, certainly 5 Mile Point is an example.
It tends to give a park-like look to the place, and an almost tropical, splendor because of the large limbs and this large canopy that they produce. And the fact is that, for people and creatures, you can get underneath them. There's open areas because they eventually blank out everything that's on the forest floor. There's not much grows beneath them.
It would have made sense that the cottonwoods right at the edge of the lake too.
Yeah.
You could just fall into the lake and
Move them away because they are heavy, and they don't float that well. They float all right, but they floated. If you've ever seen a large cottonwood in the lake, it's probably got an inch or so of bark showing out of the water. Whereas you get a lot of the other trees, even if they're green, float pretty high actually, considering their size.
it would have moved into, I guess, sort of the commercial realm.
Summer of 44 was sort of an interesting time. I was turning 18 in April, and had got my little notice from Her Majesty, well, His Majesty at that time, and reminding me that I had to go and appear for a medical and so on. And so in high school, we sort of trooped down out of junior matriculation, grade 12, and did that. And I guess about April, looking for men, and they had pretty well rounded up everybody that they could either persuade or coerce into going into service, and the Forest Service was looking around for candidates to replace the previously available manpower, and so they began recruiting young people at university, first year probably, and particularly high school students. I think because I was very active in Boy Scouts, and because I had a couple of friends whose fathers were in the Forest Service, sort of got the word that they were going to accept some applications. So we went down to the Forest Service office at that time was in the courthouse, and a large warehouse about where the present forestry building is, but that's all that was there. The Nelson Ranger office was upstairs in the building on the corner of Ward and Baker with the tower, the old KWC block. It was District Rangers or the Nelson Range office was there. On the waterfront at the CPR Flats, there were a couple of large orange and white antenna towers. Actually, I guess they were spliced timbers, where the Nelson PO was installed. Okay, so anyway, that was sort of the perception I had of the Forest Service in operations, because in those days I think we were all aware of forest rangers, but not much else, you know, because firefighting was really the activity that the public was aware of. I think unless you were in the actual logging business or the lumber business, people didn't see the Forest Service. But as young people, we also were aware of an activity under the Canadian Forestry Association. And I remember going to see films. Mostly were aimed at firefighting, protection, you know, don't leave fires burning, all that sort of thing. And they were recruiting young people in the 30s particularly to join the Canadian Forestry Association. And originally they gave you a little copper colored badge you could wear. And then they decided to go further and they issued red shirts and green ties. And they came almost, I think those of us who were active in Boy Scouts saw the junior forest wardens, as they were called, as almost against the Boy Scouts, because they took up, not that they were against the Boy Scouts in that sense, but they occupied the amount of time that you had available for Boy Scout activities. They were doing junior forest warden stuff. While a lot of us sort of belonged to both, we managed to fit it in. But so that I think also probably contributed. So anyway, we went down to the courthouse and found a Forest Service office and filled out the application forms. And then I understood later that they checked back at school to see what kind of students we were and what kind of people we were as school students. One of the interesting things was that I was told that when I was going out to farm, it said, can you drive? And while I was 18, we didn't have a car at home, and I had no opportunity to learn to drive. Although I was pretty confident I could probably do that, you know. But anyway, I said, no, I can't. I don't have a license in that. And I think only 2 people that ended up on the crew we were on actually had driver's licenses, which were 16. And so they said, well, put it on there anyway, because this is one of the things that they click down when they're making the assortment. So, you know, you're not going to be on the highway anyway, sort of thing. It's just one of the things they didn't expect us to be. So anyway, we filled those forms out and then went back to school, wrote exams and so on, and almost forgot about it. And Boy Scouts Nelson had been offered, at that time, they were re-lifeboating in the Sukin. And they took off the big old welded steel lifeboats, and they made them available to the Boy Scouts. And I think the Girl Guides were offered 1 or 2. Anyway, our scout troop, which was the second Nelson, got one. And of course, they were just huge, almost unmanageable hulls. So we got an idea, Bob Coventry and myself, that we would make a sailboat out of ours. So we went down to Paul Lumber Company, which is an interesting thing. Paul Lumber Company used to supply the stuff that any of us made projects out of, because they focused on white pine, because they were in the matchblock business. And they had huge air-dried stacks of just beautiful white pine, kind of white pine that people would give their eye teeth to get a hold of today. Right. I can remember seeing stacks of boards that would be darn near 2 feet wide and an inch thick, mellowing out in the air-dried piles. Then we got an 18-foot long 4x4. Seems hard to believe, 18 feet in one piece. And we took it home and draw knifed it down to a taper. and we put a foot stuck in the thing, and we found an old sail that somebody had made for another boat, but it was one of those sort of a lateen type sail. It wasn't a triangular sail. It was. We looked up one of our scout manuals on being a scout sailboat, sea scout, and found out how to rig one of these things, and we rigged this thing up. A couple of pieces of clothesline wire and a couple of tighteners. And then we had to build a rudder for the rear end, because the rudders that came originally with those lifeboats disappeared. Somebody must have wanted the iron or something off them, and so there wasn't any rudder. So we had to construct a wooden rudder and a tiller. And we sailed it a couple times, but it was a real tub, and of course had no keel. Anyway, it was about 12th or 13th of June. I just finished writing the exams, and I was sailing off the shore just off the Lakeside Park, and a sudden gust of wind came up, and that old flat-bottom boat turned right over. So I was upside down, in the lake. And then, because it was big and because it had air tanks at either end, as soon as the side of it got into the wind, it would turn it over. And then when it got that big wet sail up, it would turn it over. And so it would not stay upright. And so I was in the water maybe 15, 20 minutes, and turning kind of purple and blue patches, and just about deciding to abandon the boat and swim for shore. When I decided the way to stop the thing from turning over would be to swim out to the end of the mast and grab hold and then tear the sail out loose. So I did. The only thing is the boat immediately turned upside down. It didn't right itself again. And so I climbed up on the bottom of the boat. By then, Dr. Ray Shaw had been phoned by somebody on this side of the lake saying, hey, there's somebody spilled over there. And he had a very powerful runabout boat. And so he sailed out with a couple of blankets with him, and got me in the blankets, and took the boat in tow and pulled it over to the boathouses that were down the foot of the street here. By then, the fire department arrived, but I was fine, other than being vividly purple and, and that. Yeah. So anyway, that was, I guess, a typical use of local product. Anyway, we same day when I got home was a note telling me to show up the next day at the Forest Service, complete with all these items. A pair of good substantial boots and a couple of pair of trousers and so on. And so.
And this was for a fire crew?
Yeah, an attorney went and to report at the warehouse office. So at 10 o'clock in the morning we assembled there, and I offered with me, and then I met the other guys that were from Nelson that were coming to join the crew. There was Bob Coventry, Joe Perrier, Jim Fisher, other guys. I just don't recall at the moment. Anyway, they boarded us on the back of a 2-ton or 3-ton maple leaf stake truck with a steel deck and a wooden sides, and said, you're going down to Kelly Creek, and you'll be looking after the roadway up to the trail up to the Beaver Lookout, which we were going to follow. At that time, they didn't, until there was a fire season on, apparently they didn't put a lot of lookout men in place. So off we went and set up camp on Kelly Creek. The road went up, it was a logging road originally, and it came past a sawmill, which was abandoned at that time, but which had been water powered with a Pelton wheel. And about a quarter of a mile past that, I guess, the road crossed from the right-hand side of the creek to the left-hand side. And that location had a bit of a flat, and so that's where we established our camp. Put up 2 sleeping tents and a cookhouse tent and a storage tent. In the next couple of days, we found a nice lookout spot in the sunny side of the hill where we dug a Johnson bar facility,
Mm-hmm.
and the local school teacher that taught us in junior high school, and his wife and their daughter were our camp foreman, and she was we were joined by a couple of other fellows, a fellow from Creston and a guy from Grand Forks. The fellow from Creston stayed with our crew until about mid-August, I think. Joe Perrier opted to, they wanted somebody to go up to Golden or somewhere in that winter area over there somewhere, and he went over there. About 6 of us on that crew. I'd always had an interest in radio, and I'd taken the signaling course and got my signaler's badge in Scouts. And so I was peremptorily handed with the responsibilities of the portable radio, which was a backpack unit, which we hung on a I-4 in the cook tent, and used it as the local radio, and I climbed a tree, and I learned to use climbers, which were quite different from the things that the guys in the telephone and the power companies used. Yeah, they were dangerous things. They were real spikes. And we had to learn very quickly that you don't dig spikes in. You just put them in enough to take a grip. If you dug them in, you'd have to get somebody to come up and rescue you. You couldn't pull your feet out of the hooks out of the tree. But that was an interesting thing to learn, and to use a safety belt. And then we tried to be loggers and use a bunch of rope. But that's more of a trick than using a safety belt. A piece of manila rope and just flipping it up and walking up as you go. It's a quick way to climb a tree that, all right, but it
doesn't have branches.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. We soon found that those guys that were loggers, boy, I had a lot of respect for them after a few days in the bush. Home we chopped wood and sawed a few things with a crosscut saw, but not vigorously and not necessary for purposes like all day long.
It would have still been hand tools for the most part.
We had everybody was issued a Pulaski, which was everybody cursed but used. A utility tool, but not entirely designed for the terrain that we were in this country where there's so much rock. I think really they originally were be very good if you were working country with heavy duff, and you had to dig through roots and make some sort of a small trench for backfiring purposes or whatever. But the problem here was that very often you were using the axe as an axe, and you had this darn narrow wedge at the back that would hang up in the branches and shrubs, and also the potential to get you bounce back on you. Then we had half a dozen 6-foot crosscut saws, and an assembly of shovels, and I think some of the dullest mattocks that were ever issued to mankind. I think by the time they equipped our crew, all the Forest Service personnel and the rangers and that all had whatever was the best of stuff, and then rightly so. But the war was on, tools weren't easy to get, and the mattocks and grubbos were down to the point where they were mostly heavy and not much blade left. That's what we had, and Indian packs, which I understand exist, although nobody carries them anymore.
Indian packs?
Yeah. These were about a 8 or 12 gallon container with a brass pump hose that's mounted on the top of the back with a short piece of hose, filled them with water, and then when you got to a fire, you pumped them like a trombone style, and it pumped water, much like a little foot pump might to bail out something. But
I believe they've also.
Well, what we learned about them was not only were they damn heavy. I forget what 12 or 14 gallons of water weighs, but it's a fair amount.
10 pounds per gallon.
Yeah, so it was all you could do to stand up with one of those things on your back. And if you were climbing in the hills, you had to go with it probably half empty. Well, that's a killer, because as soon as they're half empty, that stuff sloshes.
Right.
And it's bad enough walking or climbing, but Lord help you if you happen to have to go over a log or something and that water came up. It's some really marvelous accidents from guys practically having their head knocked off by an Indian pack coming forward. Or, trying to walk a log with an Indian backpack pump on your back. And walking along, and this stuff would start to slosh. And then if you tried, we'd soon learn that what you do is you quit trying to do anything and you let the sloshing calm down. But the instinct is when you feel that you're going to go left, is that you switch your weight to go right. Well, all that did was just increase the momentum of the fluid, and it would shove you more right. Now you'd be more right than you were left before. The attempt to correct that would put you off the log and into the shrubs. And very often the shrubs were a lot of broken branches and sharp ends and stuff. What was that about it?
The fire crews had a number of different things to do then besides fighting fires.
Yeah, right. What we were sort of like on standby all the time. Suppression crew was on standby. And it didn't matter whether it was raining or sun or what it was like, you were on standby. And so if we were working on the road, what we were doing actually was working the old log road ran out about where the camp was. And the previous year or two, some people had been in doing some work, and they had widened the thing out so that it was what would now be called a jeep road, I guess, about 6 feet wide, 8 feet wide. Most of the shrubs and trees and stuff knocked out of it. And then it made to fill between the large rocks that you couldn't crowbar out. And it went up, I would say above our camp about 1.5 miles. And where they left off was a large chunk of rock. So we couldn't really do much when we first got there, but they brought in 2 fellows from Erie who were a big old Finn and something. I was amazed that I thought he was an old Italian, but it turned out he was a Finn. He looked sort of like one of those pictures, those sumo wrestlers, that sort of a build. This guy was maybe 70 years old at this time. But he had a young fellow working for him, in the mines, who held the drill although he would spend the whole, he could swing that 12-pound hammer all day long. Just up, you hear this sound, and wham, boy, he could, and he never, all the time we were there, and he did a lot of work while we were there. For this, never hit that guy's hand, never hit, And they were very careful about steel too. One of the hazards is flying chips of steel from the top of the drill, and particularly for the guy who's holding the steels to get it started anyway. Until you get a decent hold, hand drill, you have to hold the darn thing. Yeah. And the other thing you have to do is turn it. Yeah. Single jacking is when a fella has a lighter hammer and does it all himself. Well, that's okay if you're not dealing with really hard rock. You can probably pound into concrete or softer rock. But if you get that really hard granite, it takes too long to make any progress. Anyway, they came and they blasted and worked on this chunk of rock. Well, as soon as they got it to the point where we could over it readily, we couldn't take our pickup truck. We had another gift given to our camp. Nobody wanted it, and we had the flat deck truck where it was available. And this was a thing that looked like a Caterpillar tractor that somebody had made a mistake on. It was very narrow and very long. It was about 14 or 15 feet long, and only about, at most, I'd say, well, it wasn't quite, it was maybe a little better than 3 feet wide. But apparently a marine engine, an old diesel, tracks that I think came off a Fordson tractor. And it had been originally built in Oregon. And it had a combination blade in the front and a winch. And the blade was designed so they could make fire guard underneath the redwood trees and stuff like that. Well, it had enough power for the kinds of rock pushing and stuff we needed it for. But after one day of us using it in the bush, we decided no way, because if you went over anything the size of a grapefruit, you roll that machine over it, it was totally unsafe.
Yeah.
It was too narrow and they had no
Inappropriate for the country.
Yeah, but it had one good feature, and that was it had a big winch and cable on the front. So after we got through the rock pile, we were able to take it up, and we ran into about 60 or 70 foot long strip of cedar muck, just totally black muck on the hill. I remember the first day we were there, and we got to the stuff, and it was fairly dry that day. Well, it didn't dry for a few days, actually, at the time we got to work on this. And so we took this little cap, and we pushed a nice chunk out of this stuff, and went in there with hand tools and cleaned it up. Thought, boy, we have an easy piece here. We've got a nice chunk of road. Well, it rained that night. We come out in the morning, and you couldn't even see that we'd been there. All that black muck had just filled the whole space in. And of course, then we couldn't do anything. You'd go in there and try and take a shovelful of stuff. You'd take a shovelful out, and you couldn't see where you shoveled it. So we've decided that what we'd have to do was we'd slog our way through that and work on the other side of it, which was mostly dirt. And so we built quite another half-mile road, leaving this thing in place. But at one point in August, it dried out quite well. And so what we did was we went in and cut this slot out. And then we went in the bush and found a couple of big dead cedar, fell it, split it with wedges, made it into two nice, huge timbers. Yeah. And then we were able to pull them out of the bush with the cable. Yeah. But when we unwound the cable, we found we couldn't handle it. It was just full of slivers. So one of the interesting things I learned about bureaucracy and government in those days was that, so I got on the radio and said, the guy in the Nelson office, the radio office, said that we wanted to order half a dozen pair of good sturdy leather gloves because we had this cable we had to handle. And he said, okay, I'll pass it on. And so we got a radio message back from the district forester saying, there is no way that we're going to buy gloves for anybody. If you can't use that cable, then you'll just have to do without. There's no replacement cable, and that's that. There's no authority to buy you guys leather gloves. So we were pretty downhearted, but an old-time forester dropped into our camp one day for, I forget, he was there on some purpose anyway, and and we were bitching after supper about this situation. We couldn't haul this stuff out of the bush, and we couldn't use the cat. And the only good thing about it, really, in our mind, was that it had this winch, and we could have used it a lot of times. So he said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, we can't buy any gloves. He says, hop in the pickup truck. Down to Fruitvale we went. Walked in, general store there. Also, we had a gas pump outside and that. He said, want half a dozen pair of leather gloves. The guy roots around the back, comes out, puts out half a dozen pair of leather gloves. And they said, okay, he says, charges for so many quarts of oil. So we got a bill for oil, which was never, we needed oil to run everything. So we got our gloves. So then we had catch-22 process came into view. All the scroungers that you've read books about. We suddenly knew that there was a method, not to be abused, but under essential terms. And in that way, we acquired a good machete and a couple other things that we really used a lot and were very valuable at camp. So.
And did you have any fires that were memorable?
Well, I guess the first one's always memorable. We were in camp, I think, 3 days when a brief overnight rainstorm and lightning came, and we had a landline telephone up to the lookout. Then Harry Mitchell, who was the chap at the Beaver Lookout, called down and said that he could see a smoke right above the town of Fruitvale, but about 2/3 away up in those almost perpendicular hillsides. It had been logged off years ago, and had a young growth going up in it, but there were a lot of standing snags, and one of them was on fire, and we could see this thing right there. So this is our first fire, and we're not conditioned by this time or anything by exercise and camp work or anything.
Right.
So off we went, and so we had to pack a lunch. Lunch was a can of tomatoes and a loaf of bread. That's what we were issued, because nobody was ready for it. It's just one of those things. We were just there too soon and not organized. And so that's what we did. We all packed a loaf of bread and a can of tomatoes. And all our gear. And I mean all our gear. Like I had a radio on my back, a Pulaski, and a shovel. And so, everybody was loaded like as if we were just walking down to load the truck or something, when we got off the... Anyway, I guess about 2.5 hours later, we managed to get up to this fire, which, 3 or 4 weeks later, we'd have each taken the appropriate tool for whatever was needed. Not everybody with a lot of extra gear, and we'd have been probably on the run to that fire, and not hooped out. Anyway, we did get up that snag, and it was really steep on the side of the hill where the snag was. So we were trying to figure out whether we should drop the snag, take a chance that it would fall down up the hill. We tried peeing on it with the backpacks and everything else we could think of. And it was an old, I think if I remember right, it was an old tamarack snag, and it was split, and when the lightning had hit it, it had burned and charred down in the crack. So finally one of the guys, after having to go down the hill quite a ways to get some more water, on the way up discovered a patch of dirt and mud. So we went down there and we shovelful by shovelful brought dirt and mud up, and we packed the crack at the bottom. And got that part of the fire out in there. And then we dropped the snag uphill. And luckily it landed with the crack up, so we didn't have any projection of sparks in the material. And then we just went down and sprayed it and packed that crack with more dirt. And so we ended the fire. It was an innovative process, And so that was our first fire. And we had a number of terrible expeditions. One of them was up above Erie Creek, up Champion Lake Way. And the first place we tried to get off the road, you couldn't, you see these pictures of guys trying to hack their way through the jungle. I don't think people realize in this area, or maybe they do. We certainly didn't, because that whole hillside had been burned off at some point and had been regrown with hemlock. And it was like trying to go through, if you'd suddenly become a miniaturized person, we're trying to go through a lawn. Well, the hemlock was so dense you couldn't push a foot through the stuff. And so we had to drive all the way down to Champion Lake and go up an old logging road there, and then hike over the hill into the top end of Erie Creek. And then when we got there, there was no smoke. So I had to keep stringing this fish line and the portable wire antenna over a snag, and then try and get a hold of Harry on the radio up at the Beaver Lookout to see if he could tell us where the fire was. And the maps scales were not too large in those days, and so and we didn't have photographs with us. They were all up on the lookout. Later on, we got a photographer to give us this. We photographed some of our area where we noticed the fires were occurring quite regularly, and had small carryable prints with it, so that if we were on the ground, at least we could say, well, this is where we are, and we could see where we were going. As it was, we spent a lot of time thinking we were going in the right place, climbing over a hill and finding out it was better to go around down there, because the map didn't indicate there was anything in between, but there were 3 or 4 gullies and a lot of stuff. But when we did get to that fire, we had to leave 2 guys there because it wasn't much of a fire, but it was in a lot of duff. And so we left him. We willed them each a backpack, and everybody chipped in all their lunch and groceries, and we left them there for the night. And so they just dug around that small fire, and eventually two came, and then they were able to pull out in about 2 days. Fortunately, somebody wiseacre had packed a sleeping bag and a fly. And we didn't know where we were going, but we just thought we would be sheltered. We weren't thinking of staying overnight. But so that was the first camp out fire training. I wasn't on that crew. I was stuck with the radio, so I had to go back. And most of the rest of us. The other thing, of course, was that we all wore boots with hobnails in the bottom. I had a pair of military-style boots. They had a very heavy sole and what they called a tap sole on top of that. And so I had what was called, I used to do a lot of hiking, and I found the hobnails would get pulled out pretty easily on rocks. So I had the shoemaker put in what they were, in those days were called Hungarian nails, which were much smaller nail, but the same idea is a hobnail. And so the sole of the boot had hobnail that goes on, a quarter plate, steel plate on the heel, a toe cap, a metal toe cap on the front, and then in the instep we had drive corks put in. So if you got a log or something, or branches you were going to, you could get a purchase on it. So innovative construction there. But on the back of that 3-ton truck with a metal deck, you have to pick your point on the side of the truck and just hang on for sure all you could, because you couldn't stand up on that metal deck. You couldn't just stand and ride. You had to hang on all the time, because you'd be off your feet in no time. And of course, we suggested we should deck it with some wood, but that was frowned on. I don't know what, it was a bureaucratic decision. It had nothing to do with practicality, but I guess if we'd have large sheets of plywood, they might allow us to do that, but they didn't want us decking it with wood. So we had to put up with that as the other thing we had, and that would have been a 39 or 40 maple leaf truck, a Chevrolet truck. The other thing we had was a 1934 Ford pickup. Those were the two vehicles that we had.
And you were...
Well, that summer, I worked that summer from mid-June to mid-September. And then there was such heavy rains, they just canceled the fire season. And we all came home. The following year, I was in senior matriculation in school. And when, by the time I was graduating in June, the war in Europe was over in May, and they weren't calling for people who didn't want recruits. They weren't planning to train anybody. Anybody that was going to go to the Japanese theater was already in the Army or the Air Force or the Navy. They were looking for new people. They were disbanding the Army left and right at that stage. And so I went to work for the radio station. And about the 5th or 6th of August, we had an extremely hot summer forty-five. And had a huge fire start up Sheep Creek. And I was walking uptown from the radio station, which was down where the Palm Dairies, the Dairy Line Food Creamery is now. And I was walking along Front Street. As I came up about where the provincial jail was, where that courtyard is in front of the White Building, a familiar voice, George Shoup, who was a district forester, he bellered out at me, "Hey, Alan, got a minute?" So innocently, I said, "Sure, George." Walked over, thinking he wanted to shoot the breeze and talk about the good old days and so on. And all he wanted to do was get me close enough to tell me that I'd go home and get my boots and, and gear and be back here in a few minutes. I was dragooned into the Forest Service again. And so I said to him, "Gee, I'm supposed to be at work tomorrow morning at 6:30. Don't worry about it." He said, "I'll phone him up and tell him. Be back here. I'm going to Salmo at 5 o'clock. So I bustled up the hill and left a note for my mother, who was at work and hadn't got home yet. I grabbed my boots and pack and blankets and some underwear and socks and headed down. And we went out to Salmo, and I got put in the ranger office there, and the fire had just really got going, and they had maybe 10 or 15 men on it at that point. So I got the job of being quartermaster and radio man and whatever in that office. Within about 2 weeks, 350 men on that fire. We had truckloads of food coming in and out, and I was busier than a one-armed paper hanger. I had to make 3 or 4 times a day trips up to where the fire crews were. A lot of the fire was up Wolf Creek and up towards Wolf Lake, and we had a lot of Russian fellows on there, working there, and they unanimously decided they wouldn't fight fire if they had to eat any kind of meat. And that was an incredible challenge because the only supply place was trail. And so I used to drive a 3-ton, similar to the one we had, 3-ton truck into trail every day and scrounge up canned tomatoes and all that kind of stuff to take out, eggs and we filled a little ranger station up, and its little garage. We just took everything out of the garage, and that became a storage warehouse. And the guys on the fire kept ordering stuff. You know, it was endless. And we had packers going in with horses, and it wasn't until we'd been on the fire, I guess, a good 3 weeks. You know, and there was just no way it was going out. There was no rain. It just burned, and there wasn't. You know, with hand tools and that, what are you going to do? You head it off in one place and it would just blow off up in some other area. And so, as the crew got bigger and bigger, one of the ways they enlarged the crew was we'd take a truck, go over to the main gate at the Cominco, and as the guys came off of their 3 o'clock shift, the tailgate down, they could climb into the back of the truck. Right. We weren't too popular with either the CMNS or the guys, but we did manage to get something like 300 some odd men on that fire.
Firefighting's always been an exciting type of sport.
Oh yeah, and you know, when you're on the job and you know what's going on and you're part of the team, it's amazing what's accomplished. And the kind of crew spirit that quickly develops, it was amazing because these people, you know, weren't working together. Most of the guys at Cominco might have been working in the same plant, but were dispersed throughout the plant. They weren't buddies or anything like that mostly. And then we had a lot of these Russian fellows, and we had some old retired miners from around Salmo. And all these guys pitching in and going on and out there. But I learned a lot, you know. Those days I would think the guys that worked for government didn't get terribly well paid. And what we learned was that as the fire grew into the end of August and into September, in the early part of September, all the big wheels in the district suddenly booked on to that fire. We had the district forester, we had the assistant, and we had the Nelson Ranger, and we had almost everybody in
getting overtime?
Well, I guess so. I mean, I know that I was getting paid 50 cents an hour, and I was putting in 16-hour days, which was more than I was told I would be making working at the radio station. But guys on the fire were working as many hours as they could stand. You know, if a guy felt he could work 2 shifts, he'd work 2 shifts. If he'd work 12 hours, he'd work 12 hours. Whatever they could, because the ruddy hard work. I was up on the fire line quite a few times, not firefighting, but distributing stuff or making sure what was going on and trying to solve some radio problems. And those guys were really, really deserved whatever they got, you know. Right. But when the fire suddenly, we had a huge rainstorm, and like overnight, we went from 300 men to 100 to 25. We had 25, I guess, for quite a few days on the fire. Just patrolling it mostly, watching to see if it was going out, and it kept raining. Well, as a result, we had almost a warehouse full of canned goods and stuff in Salmo. And so I was told to assemble the stuff and units. Units meant like when the ranger truck backed up from Preston, he got so many units, and so on. And off they went. The result was we were able to clean the fire up. Now, all the old tools got lost on the fire. I remember that. Like if a grub hole looked like it was mostly the hole for the handle, it got lost and was written off on the Wolf Creek fire. It allowed them to have a hope in hell of getting some decent tools next year.
Right.
So,
Again, somebody that understands
yeah.
bureaucracy.
Well, they were trapped in this thing, you know. At the end of the season, if you said that you had 50 shovels and you had 50 when you started, and most of them weren't worth using, and if you ended up with 28 or 30 shovels, you got those shovels back next year for use.
Right.
And you know, some of the stuff, a pick or a mattock was in fair shape, or axes that weren't ground down to nothing, where you could no longer make a cheek out of a thing. It was like a wedge. It wasn't any stuff like that. You know, that's what they were working on fires with. And so if you had a big fire, you could write a lot of stuff off. And that's what happened. They just, well, these things are not, once the fire's out, just abandon them. They're gone, you know. And they were useless. I mean, guys in the fire were just cursing them because they were given this thing as a tool, but it was not productive. And of course, the war had been on for 5 years, and everything was being conserved. And now suddenly, you know, in August, the Japanese War was over, and so you know, peace was there, and what had been going on was, so all this sort of stuff was written off. It was really quite an experience. And you know, traveling in the bush in the Salmo area was really interesting because we saw the remnants of the turn of the century logging which went on there, and down big river bottoms, and that huge cedar stumps that existed. You know, that originally when the first people were in the area were mining, I guess, but buildings and that. My God, they must have had an incredible supply of shakes and stuff in that Salmo Valley.
Were a lot of the hillsides burned off?
Oh yeah, there were. Yeah, you know, one of the fires, the most memorable fires, I guess I remember. When I was more towards the border, we ran into. We were sent down there, and a local guy was sent with us because he said, "They don't think you guys will ever be able to find it. It doesn't seem to be smoking much, but we know it's there because every now and then there's a puff of smoke comes up out of it, and it's in second growth stuff. And really, potentially a tremendous fire that could sweep for miles." So we were sent off on this thing, and we climbed up and finally got up onto a ridge. And on the way up, we came across lots of old logging flumes, you know, which had been logs down. And then we saw some dry flumes, which were just jack pine, small jack pines, maybe 20 feet to 3 feet, had been nailed to whatever was available tree, and they to make it on one side, and then a V shape like this created by driving a log in it, and they left all the bark on them, and then they would just, because it was steep angles, they just shoot the stuff down this thing, no water, just slide down the log street, just like a chute. Right. You know, and that's old technology, I guess, or dynamics. Yeah. And of course, we ran in, over a long period of time, we ran into some of the old flumes, the big flumes. I was amazed. I thought, they probably just shot, chopping blocks or something down those things. But, boy, you could see occasionally where a log had broken out of a flume and gone into the brush, and they just didn't retrieve them. Yeah. And, boy, there'd be 30-foot long, 3-foot diameter logs that were down some of those, big flumes. Imagine what kind of speed they were traveling at.
Oh, yeah.
Boy.
I guess a lot of the stuff they were after would have been sort of in the valley bottoms, too.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the early days, that's really where the logging was, and they tried not to go up the hill.
Yeah, it makes sense that those areas would be less likely to be burned.
Yeah.
And that you'd have the older, larger,
Really nice big trees. And then, and you know, like some of the big old cedars that would be standing dead would probably only be 30 or 40 feet long and then they're broken off. And, but you know, you'd see ones 8, 10 feet in diameter at the base. And you could see where guys had cut them off. You know, they'd already been dead, obviously, because you could see from the way they were ended. But they took them down for, talk about first-class quality dried wood, you know.
Right, it would be lighter too.
Yeah, and they could split that on the site. They didn't have to set up a sawmill at that time. You know, they could, with hand tools, they could produce boards. And obviously, early on, they were able to have a semblance of lumber very quickly. A couple places we found. Okay, it just came back to me, Dale, that some of the experiences with the radio. We were talking a little about this fire that I remembered so clearly. After we got up on the ridge and we were hiking along, and we had no sign of this fire. We could sort of smell occasionally, weird smell, but not like we got to know burning green needles and that kind of smoke and turpentine and oils and all that sort of thing. But just sort of a burning smell. Mm-hmm. But we couldn't see it anywhere. I mean, certainly was no sign of smoke. And we'd been out from about 4:30 in the morning, I guess we started. And this was getting close to noon. And we were beginning to grumble a bit, but you know, maybe we should find a place where there's some water that we could hunker down and have a sandwich. And we were up on one of those ridges down towards Ponderay, where it's fairly open, and the young growth was still coming up, yellow pine and that, and quite open because it had been burnt off, obviously, quite heavily, you know, prior to this, maybe 25 years before. Anyway, there were a few large old trees that had survived the fire. You know how yellow pine will, it'll burn off the bottom and you'll see it burnt, and yet the top is growing fine. And there were the odd one of those that had fallen down. And finally, we got into sort of a bit of rocky outcrops here and there out of the duff and not too much undergrowth at all. And we were standing around and everybody was saying, well, they're just, you know, maybe we should just go back home and wait till everything starts up again or something. We're just getting nowhere. And there was a tree I would guess was maybe 60, 70 feet long, laying down, and which had lost its bark. You know, most of the bark had come off the top, but it was still pretty much of a tree. And it sort of stuck out into the rocks and duff. And so I'd gladly taken this darn radio off my back, and a couple of guys that smoked, who were sitting around having a cigarette and shooting the breeze for a minute. And so I got up on top of this thing and I thought, oh, I'll just walk down to the end and see what's... So I walked down the end of this thing, and as I got most of the way along, I remember, gee, it's pretty warm up here today. You know, I felt like I was getting a lot more sunshine than I expected. So I walked down to the end of the thing, and I thought, gee, there's a nice outcropping looking down over the hill there. I'll hop off and walk over and take a look. So I hopped off onto the duff. Wow. It was just like hopping into a barbecue. As soon as the surface was about a half an inch of moss and needles and stuff that wasn't smoking, but was right underneath it was totally glowing. It was just incredible. So I looked, what on earth is this? And then of course a puff of smoke came up, you know, from my feet disturbing it. And I suddenly realized my feet were hot. So I scrambled up on the rock and climbed up on the thing, and I yelled at the guys. I said, well, at least there's some fire over here. Well, you know, ha, 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 you know, who are you kidding? So I roared back and got one of the guys, persuaded him to come take a look. Well, there it was. And I guess it was about, we figured it was about 200 or 300 feet in diameter.
And it was burning?
Yeah, it was just underneath everything. And I guess we spent the best part of 3 days trying to get a ditch in the ground around that thing, you know, and it was too far to bring water.
And there was no fairly deep duff there.
Yeah. And there was no, what would you call it, no way of, you know, there was no tankers, there was no hose lines, we were just too far in the hills for anything. And so what we did was we dug a ditch around it all, posted 2 guys on it, and then we hiked back out, and this was 2 days later, and went down the ranger station in Salmo, and they hired a couple of local guys, and they took a horse and supplies and stuff in there, and they just sat on that thing and patrolled it. But when you take a plasky or something like that and just pull that stuff, it was like exposing the coals in a barbecue pit.
Right.
Just incredible heat, and stuff was just charring. Like the underside of that log I was walking on was just absolutely black. We rolled it over and out of the fire with plaskies. We sawed off chunks and rolled it out of the fire on every stick that we could. Chopped down any trees that were there. We had a big bare area, bigger than my yard, by a lot, probably half a block. And but they were on that fire, I guess, for about a week, 10 days. It never rained, and so they had to stay there. There wasn't anything they could do except patrol it and make sure there wasn't finding some little underground way of getting out of that area where we finally been able to dig a ditch.
Yeah.
But so that really, you know, was an experience. Unlike crown fires that we occasionally ran into, which are scary, I must admit. The first time that we had a wind change and we were on a fire that was kept going up into the upper part of the trees, and it went right over our heads, just like, whew, just like a drift of wind.
Yeah.
You know, and it was all flame. You know, and of course, I wouldn't have believed before, but I could see how people could be dropped by the lack of oxygen.
Sure.
You are totally breathless. Totally.
Fire is consuming.
Oh yeah, and the other thing is it's so dark. The air is so hot that after one intake of air, you don't want to. Your nose closes down, your throat closes up. You know, it tells you, hey, don't suck that stuff in.
Yeah.
And then the only thing to do is get out. I mean, because the trouble is, you know, it's not too bad because there's either go up or downhill, and you can pretty quick, depending on the time of day, make a reasonable decision whether the wind is going to be lifting it up or sucking it down, and you can make that decision to get out. But I could see an area that might be leveler and flatter. You'd have a heck of a time knowing which way to go because fire-generated winds tend to swirl and move around. I could see how people lose their lives very, very readily. That really, and of course the smoke is the other thing, you know, because you get crown fires tend to be burning all needles and stuff, and you get huge billows of smoke, and the damn stuff rains down on you. I remember a shirt just totally useless because it's full of holes.
Right.
You know, when guys would we'd take turns with a backpack and get a quick shower and get soaked down.
Yeah.
And then your hair would be all full of burn spots.
Right.
In those days, nobody wore hard hats, and we were all young guys who probably never wore a hat at all, you know.
Right.
And lots of burned hair.
I guess what I was wondering, Alan, is if there are any other sectional things that, you know, for those now, or if we could move into sort of the...
Maybe take a whack at the history and see what
Okay, we're mobile.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I recall, Dale, about suppression through summer was interesting little bits about radio. We were operating on what was called marine band frequencies at that time, which was just around the same frequencies that some of the amateur radio bands are on. And of course, it was all tube equipment. And in order to make it mobile, we had to have batteries. And the kinds of batteries that they supplied for use were a dry cell that looked like, well, if you, for a long time there was a cylindrical thing about the size of a bottle, and with two long terminals on top. But they also made another one for commercial purposes, which was a zinc shell, which looked sort of like it might be a fanciful bomb or something. It had a pigtail top on it that would look like one of these cartoon ideas of a hand bomb. And they produced a nominal 1.5 volts. And so we had 4 of those to operate this radio as a portable, and that was the term used, portable, not mobile or anything. And so the radio unit had fairly small tubes in it, and the loudspeaker, about 3 inches in diameter, was also the microphone for the radio. And it was all mounted in a little plywood box painted gray, marine gray, and was provided by an outfit in Vancouver called, there were several names for the same company. At one time it was Spilsbury Hepburn, another time it was Spilsbury Tyndall, sometimes it was just Spilsbury, and it's the fellow who wrote a book about the West Coast airlines and all that sort of stuff. And his company, one of his associates, built these radios, and they built them originally for the fishermen, and then the Forest Service picked them up as a source of useful communication equipment. The problem in this area, of course, is that radio, even in those frequencies, is fairly long, and in order to cover an area, required a fair amount of power. So these small sets, which probably churned out a whole 5 or 6 watts at those frequencies, required a substantial antenna in order to get the signal into the air. And of course it was nominally directional because that's the way that the thing functioned. So for non-station purposes, we had an antenna which was, I think, about 40 feet of antenna wire, which is a braided copper wire, with a porcelain insulator, about 3 or 4 feet of parachute cord, and this was tied to the end of the wire. And the technique was that you would find an open branch, hopefully, that you could getting the thing over, and you would swing this insulator with the thing around like a bowl, heave it up over a branch, it would drop down the other side. Then you would pull the antenna up until the insulator on the end of the antenna was close to the branch. And then you would walk away from that tree until you had sort of a slope from the tree to your transmitter. Usually it was more convenient for somebody else to be doing the radioing. So very often you would just leave it on your back and walk away until the thing was taut. And then they would endeavor to make contact. But because of the nature of the terrain here, you couldn't talk directly usually to Nelson. In fact, from Kelly Creek, you could never talk to Nelson directly. So we used to talk to Hooknose, which was the Idaho Forest lookout, who could pick us up on the American side and then would relay the message for us. Or we talked to the guys that were up on the Canada airline station and weather station, which was up above Rossland, on the top of the Old Glory. And they would relay the message back into Nelson for us. So that was sort of the technique. The theory originally was, of course, that there was a radio at the station in the ranger station in Salmo, and in most of like Rossland and Trail, and well, Trail didn't have one, Rossland had one, Kaslo had one, Grand Forks had one. Very often, we were able to talk to the guy at Grand Forks. He would talk to Nelson. So the Nelson broadcasting facility for the Forest Service was down on the CPR flats. And they had a large transmitter, about 500 watt power. And they could talk to Vancouver and more or less the people around the district. But because of the nature of the flats, they weren't able to string up more than one type of antenna. And so it meant that they really sort of compromised using the land base, which wasn't available out in the water. And so the broad side of the antenna, the two masts ran more or less northwest, southwest. And so the most efficient side would have been facing towards Nakusp and Kelowna and that way, and or back, which would pick up Preston and down into the States, would be the most efficient ends. There would be absolutely no signal off the other ends, and then a variety of possibilities on the other. If you were designing that thing for optimum use, you would have had at least one other almost right angle to that setup so that you could switch the antenna to the other side.
Yeah.
It would improve the possibilities. Anyway, in the morning we used to have a sort of roundup call start about 6:30 and ran to a little after 7. And the Nelson station would call the various places, the various ranger stations in that.
Yeah.
And sometimes lookouts if they were available to the Nelson station and get the fire report for the previous day and pass the weather information. And I'm trying to remember what we call those little wooden rods in which we told the amount of moisture in the content. And it's escaped me and I can't remember, but we had a set of these little wooden rods and the balance measure, which told how much moisture they had picked up, and you got a moisture reading, which was relayed on. And anyway, the other thing was that in order to get somebody's attention on a fire call, he always had usually a piece of old crowbar that had been bent around in a forge and turned into a gong, much like the picture you'll see of somebody calling a cookhouse.
Sure.
Time to eat. You'd have something that would approach that. So what we had was an old, we couldn't find any kind of a gong thing, but somebody had a very small old, one of the little small crowbar with a nail puller,
Yep.
type pinch bar. And so we hung that up on a piece of rope, and we hung it down in front of the loudspeaker of the thing, and another hunk of iron, and bang, bang, bang. You just turn on the transmitter, and bang, 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 and they would know that was a fire call. That whoever happened to get it would, after you stopped banging, got somebody's attention, they would announce what station they were,
Yeah.
and you would then come on and tell them where you were and what information you were trying to relay. So in the morning, the calls would come out, and we could hear a lot of calls, like we could hear Nelson calling these people, but we couldn't be received by Nelson. So he would do the morning roundup. And there was an old Swede over in Grand Forks who was out on the lookout there, and he would call in. And we had call letters, which are much like ham radio call letters or broadcast station call letters. And at that time, the call letters for the Forest Service sequence of different stations all began with CQ. Well, they had CQ AL, CQ B4, and so all this kind of stuff. And the one at Grand Forks was CQ4Q. And this old Swede would hear this call, and the guy would say, "Hello, Grand Forks. This is Nelson, VNSO, whatever it was. And what's the situation?" And the guy would say, "Good morning, Fork you back." And this great Swedish accent. So that was a bit of hilarity that we all enjoyed every morning.
You back.
Yeah. We didn't
radios a fairly new arrival in the woods?
Well,
at that
no,
time?
they must have had them for quite a while. I think they were gradually. I think as many portables as we had at that time was becoming quite unusual.
This was in, say, the mid-40s or something
Well,
like
yeah.
that?
Well, it was during the war, and so they weren't adding them in the war. So these were things that they'd had before the war began.
Okay.
So that I would think that most of the equipment would have been late 30s.
Okay.
Yeah.
What would those radio units have weighed?
I'm trying to think. I think about 35 pounds with the two batteries.
Batteries would last you for...
Well, in the field, you're really only on the air maybe for a matter of 30 seconds or a minute at a time, and so I think I replaced batteries about 4 times during that summer.
Okay.
We always had like a pair that we were working with and a pair that we had on hand, and then we had a regular storage battery that we used for camp, because we just took it with us. So they didn't have the radio in camp when we were on a fire, or if we were up the hill any distance away from camp. But there was the old landline telephone, which was a single wire thing with little pony insulators hung on trees and stand-up lines and that all the way up to the lookout.
Okay.
One of the adventures that Bob Coventry and I had was we'd only been in camp for a few days, 3 or 4 days, and it was a tremendous windstorm. And the guys who had set up the camp, the lookout tent, which was a frame about 8 foot square with a 2x4 framed roof, but no wood on it. And then there was this heavy oiled made canvas top, which fit over the standardized frame and had roll-up sides so that the lookout would be in the shade and wouldn't be hit by the sun, and that, but all 4 sides could be rolled up and he would be able to look all the way around. And in the middle of it, he had a round table with a graduated thing like a giant compass, and then they had an instrument in the middle of it mounted in this pivoted in the center, which called an alidate, which was leveled, and then he would aim it at wherever the fire was, and he would get a reading, and he could tell that there was a fire at such and such a bearing. And then he had a big large map of a book of maps, photographs, which he could look at and say they had gradations on each side, so he could give a bearing on the photograph as well. So he would take a sighting, and then he would look at the photograph and say, well, it's about there, and then he would say, well, these are the turning points. Mm-hmm. And then he could also give you a bearing from his location to where it was, and those things were all mapped in the Forest Service office, so that it helped quite a bit to determine where a fire was. But in this country, with so many terrain changes and vertical things that don't show up too well in a photograph, it's very difficult to know whether the thing was on the ridge or in the hole. Yeah. And the difference between being on the ridge and the hole could be half a mile. So it was pretty important if you could get a better fix on a thing to do that. But he had both a radio and the landline phone. And landline phone was a single wire, and he used a magneto-type phone, and you would crank the phone until you got enough juice to ring the thing. Yeah. But very often the darn wire would be down, and of course if it was on the ground it would probably bleed some of the energy off, so it was always a matter of continually checking the phone and patrolling. And but the phone was only connected between that phone was only connected between the lookout and our camp, suppression camp. Sure. From our camp into town, we had a 2-wire. And
this again would have been, say, in the 40s or thereabouts.
Yeah. It's the old style of doing it, and it was reasonably good.
I was going to ask, were you generally able to make great weather conditions cause trouble?
Yeah, occasionally. I think we used to quite often find we were talking to a fish boat off San Diego or someplace like that because of the atmospheric changes different times of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had one spot, we used to, when we were working on the road, we used to just take a radio and just hang the antenna up, and we just leave it on, running on standby, which took very little energy. And every now and then something would come on, and yet there'd be no clanging, so you'd know it wasn't a fire call or something.
Yeah.
And here would be somebody in a fishboat, and usually it was way down in California somewhere. And then they get that skip effect, like you do with the CB radio.
Sure.
That same sort of thing. Yeah.
You have some interesting conversations with...
Well, it would never be two ways. So you'd be able to hear them, but you wouldn't be able to get back to them because of the location.
The antenna was used for both receiving and transmitting.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
In camp, we had a T-shaped one, like, it was strung between two high trees and then a drop wire down the center, so that a much more efficient antenna in the camp, but only efficient in the direction it was pointing in, and we're perfectly aligned for any one place, and we could never talk to Salmo, for instance, yet they were only, around the corner from us.
Yeah.
We could talk to the guy at the Old Glory, but we couldn't talk to the ranger in Wasson.
It's quite common to have messages passed.
Oh yeah, relay, a lot of relay.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of reeling, yeah. And the Americans were very, very, very helpful. We very often got our messages to Nelson via hook notes on the American side.
They would just try to get out.
Yeah, they would hear us and talk to us on radio, and then it would landline phone into the Nelson office. They were using the same technology we were. They just did. They of course, a couple times when I was down across the line and went up to see one of their stations, their lookout towers were the sort of thing that you see in the movies, steel structure, like a bridge, 100 feet in the air with a building on top and a completely outfitted kitchen, toilet, everything up there, because it was a major effort to get up and down that thing. And except in lightning storms, they would stay in that tower, sleep there and everything. But they also, they had a standard shortwave receiver that they could tune to all sorts of things. And then they had fixed band receivers, one that was fixed on our frequency, Western Forest District, and one for their own and one for Washington, one for Idaho, that sort of thing. And they had all that stuff. It was incredible to go to one of their camps and see, the amount of technology that they had even then involved in a remote mountain close to the border.
And a higher level of funding, I guess,
Yeah.
to make that happen.
And of course, they'd only been in the war a couple of years, and so they were still producing all that stuff and making it available. So they had what was essentially military equipment that they were using, stuff that had been built for the fish packing industry.
Actually, that's something I hadn't thought of, but of course, being in the Commonwealth, Canada was in the war before the States was.
Oh yeah, and one of the things was that we had a lot of radio equipment built in Canada for the armed services, but outfits like Forest Service and that never received any of that equipment.
The radio must have been, then as now, a pretty cool piece of equipment.
Oh yeah, even as difficult as it was still really important. It really gave you the opportunity to be away from a fixed location and able to do something. It's like being in a fire hall where the only way you could get a fire call would be by a signal box or something. And so if somebody wasn't there watching it all the time, you wouldn't know if there was a fire or not. And the same thing out in the bush. We could take our crew and work up the road, say, a couple of miles, and be doing something useful instead of polishing the headlights or something. And at the same time, if a fire call came, we could just grab our equipment and be on the way.
Yeah.
So, it was really really useful. And of course, once they got reliable communication, and then you could do a lot more things.
Sure.
You know, I think it was like we had six fellows on our crew plus the people in the camp, and except at night, nobody could really leave camp.
Hmm.
You know, whereas with modern radio equipment, if you want to go down and say that, like we might have gone down to Fruitvale to have a bottle of pop or something, or talk to a girl or something, you wouldn't dare do it because you have no way of keeping in touch.
Yeah.
You know, and hardly fire a rocket into the sky or something like that, you know, which would have been about the next alternative way of alerting somebody.
Yeah.
So, I think they saw very early the possibilities in the Forest Service of radio communications was that the technology was not as adaptable as it became even after the war. I mean, even though they had difficult, bulkier units and more difficult frequencies, and a lack of relay stations, which all of these things we have now, in those days, of Pony Expressing radio.
Great. I think I'm just going to pause this for now.
Yeah, one of the things about having the responsibility on the suppression crew for the radio set was sort of strange, because I think the guys that had to pack the Indian pumps didn't appreciate the fact that I had you know, like 35 pounds or so of gear and a hand tool, and they were slugging around with 80 or 90 pounds of weight, and I think they thought that, you know, 90% of the time it wasn't used, so what the heck was, you know, the point of it all. But on the fire several times we had people hurt, not badly, but we could see that, and certainly I could, but I'm sure everybody else could on the crew too, that if the injury had been worse, it would have really been useful to have alerted somebody so that an ambulance or a vehicle of some sort could have got to us, and we could have got that person to help.
Especially if it was a situation where,
you know, so that from that point of view, it was a crew thing that was good. The other thing was kind of just very much aware of our connection with all the other parts of the thing. I mean, you know, whether it was the administration in the head office in Nelson, the assistants we could call on from the Salmo assistant ranger, all those kinds of things, the help we could have got, you know, in various ways, was available to us. And at the same time, the people who might want to tell us something knew that there was at least a chance they could get to us. In the past, if a crew went off to do something, they were gone, and they didn't leave a paper trail behind them. So once they were into the bush, they were gone. You wipe them out until they showed up again somewhere.
yeah,
And you don't know whether they were alive, dead, doing a job, or just sitting under a tree having a good time. You know,
and if something came up that you wanted to move them onto, you had no way of
doing that.
until
So
you tracked them down.
radio added a whole dimension. But I think that the fact that we couldn't use it as much as we'd like to, you know, like might have liked to have used it, diminished the apparent reason for packing all this stuff, and then you know, very often we went for days without, other than the morning report, ever using the radio. Because a lot of times it was more convenient just to pick up the phone than to go through a relaying of messages, you know.
You were definitely in a specialist role.
Yeah, well, it was unusual because what happened was that a couple of guys that had driver's licenses, like there was Bob Cumtree and Stan Fisher, both of whom were pretty good drivers. Stan's family had a trucking business, and so he learned to drive heavy vehicles and was very competent at it. And Bob was a good driver. He used to deliver flowers for his dad and stuff, so he was used to driving a lot. But both those guys were named our drivers. So Bob used to mostly drove the pickup truck, which was sort of a gopher vehicle. And Stan drove the big truck. So whenever we had to go and move on a fire or pick up equipment or transfer, and we quite often did transferring stuff around for other guys in the Forest Service. If there was equipment at Salmo that needed to go to Nelson, they would just give us a call and we'd arrange to have the truck come around and do that, or we'd go into town and pick up supplies and drop them off at various places and so on. So all that sort of stuff, went on. Those guys had sort of specialized jobs in the thing too. But amongst us, after we were sort of at ease with hand tools and stuff like that, we knew who the two guys would be on a fire who would use the crosscut saw. What guy would be given a double-bitted axe and do the actual falling. Because it's more efficient, and we didn't need a crew chief to tell us. We all knew that so-and-so was a hell of a lot better and safer with a double-bitted axe than somebody else, and you could depend on to do it. Somebody else was good at pulling the saw, and that sort of thing, so that you tended to work the things out. And I was just, I guess, fortunate in the sense that I got that particular job to do. But sometimes it was a pain in the neck because some of the guys would be just packing a shovel and a lunch, and I'd be packing 35 pounds.
Yeah.
So, there's soft.
You tended not to trust other people to carry your radio.
Oh, yeah, no way. Yeah.
Hey, Alan, we should move to the other
area part
I
of
was
it.
thinking
Yeah.
I might touch on, which is, like, you're known as a local historian, so to speak, and wondering about some of the earlier accounts of, I guess, white men in the area.
Well, I guess...
Those related to the forests that they would have encountered and things like that.
Yeah, I guess what we now know, or are beginning to get a glimpse of, is that when Thompson came down the Columbia and wanted to see, he really began the process in a very circuitous way. He'd already been down to Fort Colville before he made his journey out to sea. And he'd come down the Moyet River and across Coeur d'Alene Lake that way into Fort Spokane and then up to Colville. And then back up the Columbia. And before he returned, he went back out to sea. And so that is about as early as we know of anybody even being close to the Kootenays, which is just around after the turn of the century, 1806, something like that. We have a diary note from a fellow named Kitson, who was a Hudson Bay Company employee, which were just totally unexpectedly in the Hudson Bay journals in Red River journals in London originally, and then they moved up to Winnipeg. So this fellow Kitson writes about coming down the Kootenay River. I'm not in my mind, I don't just recall the exact date, but before any other known explorers were on here. And he writes and said that he could almost not see. This was in the fall. One shore or the other because of the smoke on the West Arm.
Fires.
From wildfires that were burning all through the district, and the smoke was just hanging in the bottom. The other thing you know is that by late September and into the fall, there wasn't a heck of a lot of water coming down the West Arm. It didn't look like a lake to him, it looked like a river.
Right.
With fairly large pools, like between, say, Harrop and Kokanee, between Kokanee and 9 Mile, between 9 Mile and 6, 7 Mile in that area. And again, they were large pools of almost still water with just these small, narrow areas going out, and which later on created a great deal of hazard problems for the original steamboaters once they got to a sizable boat, because those sandbars were out so far.
Right.
And very early on, they had to build navigation aids. And then in the winter they froze up and they couldn't even come down the thing, which by 1900 they had built the connection to Balfour, Proctor, and Nelson, so that they didn't have to try and come down the arm. They could do their freighting and passenger transfer at Proctor.
The CPR line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess by the early 1864, something like that, there were survey parties in this area. And G.B. Martin, who was the lands person in the late 30s, was an old man at that time. But he came to Nelson in 1897 and spoke to gathering in Nelson and recalled that he'd been in Nelson 34 years before.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And he said things had changed in 97. Things had changed a bit since he was there. And then he revealed that he was a member of a party hired by the Hudson Bay Company to brush out a trail. And this was before Dewdney, whose name was given to the trail. And at that time he had a real mad-on with Dewdney, who was the lieutenant governor. Because he said, like, Dewdney went around and laid a lot of cornerstones. And that was his contribution to the opening up of the country. And
So this was a trail that this fellow had cut in this area?
Yeah, right. The section going across the Salmo Crescent and also from Christina Lake over to Fort Shepherd was all cut by the Hudson Bay Company as a trail. And what they did was they followed the Indian walking trails and brushed them out wide enough so that a pack horse could take a load. And so it wasn't a matter of being 3 feet wide. It had to be about 6 or 8 feet wide, because a pack horse with a couple of packs on each side is a fair size. It's going to take either of them up if he's going to maneuver at all with any kind of boxes or bags and stuff on it. It's going to take a fair amount of space. And that was all brushed out before Dewdney came along, and he said all Dewdney did was clean it up. And then it became known as the Dewdney Trail, because the original Dewdney Trail, which Dewdney did build as an engineer, was just extended the thing. But what he was getting at was, in this area, all he was doing was following what would become the Hudson Bay Trail, which was just an improvement on the Indian walking trail.
Okay.
So, by the time settlement was attempted here at Nelson, 1888, 89, somewhere around there, this area was covered with a very light covering of willows, alders, nothing substantial, and a lot of standing dead fern stuff. There seems to be a little confusion in all the stuff I've read as to whether the wildfires that swept through this whole area from the outlet at Proctor all the way down to Brilliant occurred in 85 or 83. Some accounts say it was 83, some say it was 85. It's hard to know. Groman was in this area in that period. He doesn't mention them fires being alive at the moment he was here. But people who came not long after him in doing survey work noted that there was no merchantable timber, as far as they were concerned, along either side of this thing, because it all been burnt. And the earlier records of people in Nelson are that there was nothing but a lot of deadfall and standing snags. And a few pictures we have, there are some big cottonwoods down on what was the CPR Flats, that area, and then a lot of spurs sticking up out of the undergrowth, and nothing substantial. When George Dawson from the geological surveys came here and took his famous first photograph of Nelson, it just looks like a lot of willow and scrub, and the odd snag standing up. There are no noticeable trees in Nelson, and And that was, say, 89. 91, we have our first real photograph of downtown Nelson, a few pioneer buildings already up. And you can just see the hills over in the Rosemont area and everything. It's just rock and a lot of burnt over trees and that.
There's been some debate over whether those major wildfires were natural or man-caused.
Well, I would. I know I've read a number of accounts in which they said that the Ainsworth party, which came in to take a look at the Bluebell Mine and also discovered the Ainsworth Hot Springs, that is, they discovered them from white man point of view. The Indians and a few members of the fur traders who occasionally came through, and very occasionally because there wasn't a lot of fur around Kokanee Lake itself, they were aware of those springs being there. The Indians certainly had known about them for hundreds of years, and that they weren't a secret. But there were a lot of hot springs in the Kokanee, so it wasn't unusual to find hot springs. But the Ainsworth party, in theory, the story was that on their way out, they lit some fires. Well, it's possible they may have lit a fire where they thought they already saw a possibility. And one of those would have been the gold copper stains about where Beasley Bluffs is. But other accounts indicate that the country had been burned over in '83 and both sides, and it's unlikely that even a group of determined firelighters could have burnt the whole thing for the distance from the main lake all the way down to Brilliant.
And that was well before the rail line.
Oh yeah, there was nothing, no activity whatsoever.
January 13th, 1994, completion of interview with Alan Ramsden and Dale Anderson. Well, Alan, shall we pick up where we left off?
Well, we'll pick up pieces anyway, Dale. A couple things that struck me. We were wanting to talk a little bit about the lumber industry and particularly around here, perhaps. And what I think is that we might just sort of recall that the first people that settled on the shore of Kokanee Lake at what is now Nelson, I think in our minds quite often we think of them as sort of pioneer outdoor types with images of log cabins neatly hewn and or other things done by expert woodsmen and so on. And the truth of the matter, by and large, is that most of these people were prospectors, and a lot of them were not, as today, trained prospectors, nor were they experienced woodsmen or outdoorsmen, trappers and that. They were mostly farmers and storekeepers who decided to go looking for gold.
Okay.
And so when they came to a place like Nelson, they usually brought with them a tent or a tarp or something, and didn't really plan on building a structure. So I guess it was a surprise to find a wooden structure here fairly early on, but I suspect that was probably done by people like Martin Fry, who was a trapper by trade and who lived in a rural setting all his life and probably knew how to handle an axe and maybe even had a saw of some sorts with him because he came by boat around from Bottom's Ferry out of the Kokanee system.
Right.
But it does recall then to me that there was a lot of available material for construction in a pioneer quick throw-up basis without having to go to the formality of a logging or lumbering business to get some shelter.
Sure.
Standing cedar could be knocked over as long as you could split it. You could get wonderful boards out of a cedar just with a wedge and a hammer and a back end of an axe or some tool like that.
Sure.
And split shakes are not what most people see today. Shingles on a roof. I recall lots of buildings in which there were 6 and 8 foot long shakes which made up walls and roofs and whatever. And very often were not put together with even with nails, but somebody had drilled little holes in them and wired them together, or spiked them together with wooden sticks, knots, chunks of harder wood, that sort of thing. And of course, there wasn't underground mining going on, so there wasn't large structures required to conduct elementary mining. They were looking at gold pans and sluice boxes, which could be made on site. But I suspect that after the first year or so here, that wood began to appear, finished wood, sawn lumber and stuff. And I think by the time that they were aware that there was real mineral potential here, then a few people who were quite competent at creating wood appeared on the scene. So that I think while it's very romantic to think of the guys with the two-handed saw and building a sort of a framework up, pulling a log up onto it, then one guy on top, one guy below, sawing timbers, I think that sort of thing was done as little as possible, because I don't believe that people wanted to work that hard every day for the rest of their life. It may be in a way to achieve something, but it was certainly the tough way to do it. So that it wasn't very long before we had a small sawmill right on the waterfront here. And we have a couple of old pictures around 1888, 89, which show a building on the edge of the waterfront. And I think that water power was probably used because Ward Creek ran down right through the town. And we can see in some of the early pictures, before there was any real Baker Street or anything but just a few cabins around, that there was a wooden flume coming out down there heading towards waterfront. And at first people thought that's a water line or it's a sewer. Well, we know from history that the sewer was Ward Creek, and that was as much a sewer as began the town. And a water line for no customers doesn't make sense except somebody who was going to use a volume of water, namely a sawmill, which would drive a water wheel.
So this would have been water as a source of power, not as a source of timber.
Right.
From the flume.
Right. And so we had our initial sawmill right on the waterfront, and where sawmills continued for better than half the life of the city of Nelson.
Water transportation of logs
coming down to the mill here. The other mill that was built up in Cottonwood along the flat in Upper Cottonwood, not above Rosemont in terms of going uphill, but up Cottonwood Creek above Rosemont, because they could bring water to get power, and there was a flat in there, and the hills around had timber on them, whereas along the face here, where Nelson was, it was mostly been burned off, and the growth was young and mostly suitable material for firewood or shakes. It was cedar. But it really makes you realize that a lot of wood material was used very quickly once they determined to make a settlement. I have a note, just as an example, to give you some idea of what came about here. Back before the First World War, there's a couple of notes about timber being bought down the lake. And in 1910, for instance, the Hosmer, which is the power shaft we have on the museum there, it brought down 2 million board feet to the Proctor sawmill in one tow. 2 million log feet. so they weren't measuring them. In other words, there were 2 million feet of logs in one tow. And
From elsewhere on the lake?
on the lake, probably from the Lardo end of the lake, because that seemed to be the big producer of trees.
Right.
I guess because the valley was relatively flat, they could throw the logs in the water, run them down to a holding area on the main lake at the head of the lake, and then assemble a tow and bring it down. Most of the hillsides around here were rather steep for logging access that was reasonable.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that the Lardo and the Kaslo area produced most of the log material that we had. But we also had visitations from the American side. The Tug Kaslo, which was built in 1891, and Nelson was about 2 or 3 years old as a community. Ewell and Buchanan, G.O. Buchanan, who was our original lumber mill operator at Nelson, and then the big mill that he built at Kaslo, and also one at Sunshine Bay. Now the Kaslo to be available. Buchanan had been bringing lumber to Nelson since 1884, so you could see that there was a possibility of coming from the American side down the lake. And
I had heard that American timber had come.
yeah, the Captain West, who had his own tugboat service, brought 500,000 feet of logs to the Nelson Saw and Planing Mill, which was the name of the company, and it was only part of 4 million linear feet of logs that had been bought in Idaho, and he was bringing them down from Bonner's Ferry all the way to Nelson.
Any indication of species?
No, although I would have thought that whatever was sizable timber would be thrown in the mix. I don't think that they were ordering anything in particular. I'm not sure what Idaho would be producing at that time in large amounts, but I suppose that Douglas fir and a fair amount of white pine in those days would have been the largest part of it. That's a lot. That's a pretty big order. The Halleys, which is another tugboat in 1900, brought 200,000 linear feet of logs to Nelson in one load. And you can imagine coming down that West Arm in April, which would have been pretty low water. It must have been quite a feat to get around those sandbars and that, because low water in those days would have been a lot lower than we've ever experienced it in our lifetimes. The side note of interest, I guess, the Kaslo engines, when the Kaslo wooden boat became waterlogged and had to be replaced, and then it caught fire anyway, questionable why it was burned, but they were able to take the engines and propeller and stuff out of it, and they CPR put it into their tug that they built in 1900, the Proctor, which was at that time the largest tug on the lake. Speaking about the West Arm of the lake, in 1900, when they made the extension from Nelson to Proctor, they cut 40,000 ties on the North Shore, right across from. They cleared the right-of-way, but most of the right-of-way on this side of the lake is steep, rocky bluffs, so there wasn't any real place where they could cut any amount of material, whereas the North Shore had a lot of fans and sloping away, such as at 6 Mile and that, where they could secure that. So 40,000 ties, hand cut, represents a lot of trees, I would think, because ties are of a size that would have been hand hewn, I'm sure.
Yeah, and then they wouldn't have been hewn on the railway site then. They would have been hewn on the North Shore
side, and then freighted over by barge and distributed along the lake. Which is really quite interesting, because they couldn't put the rails down until they had the ties, and so they didn't have any equipment on rail side to get those ties up onto the right of way, except at points where it was easy to get ashore. And I would suspect that Cottonwood Creek, there's a deep water spot there that has a shallow availability right to the railway. Again, at 5 Mile Troop, and at 9 Mile and at 12 Mile, across from Kokanee or Camp Woods is now Strickland Creek. Those places they probably unloaded the barge load of ties and then were distributed down probably by wagon along the right of way. Which means a lot of people were involved in the lumber business at that time. You know, this wasn't just the guy who wielded a saw and an axe or ran a sawmill, but all the people that were involved in the transportation, and so it was a very large industry.
The early stern wheelers burned wood as well, didn't they?
Yes, yes. That was the other thing I was coming to, was that shipbuilding was a major user of wood, both in the structure, but also as fuel for all of them. Burning wood was a big endeavor, and people were encouraged to pile wood in cord lot amounts at landing places, so that, particularly on the arrow lakes, that was a means of livelihood for a lot of ranchers. The early ranchers was to cut wood.
Were the boats built from local wood, do you believe?
Well, I think the first one, like the Nelson, is the first one that we're aware of that was built here. It was entirely built of the whole boat was built of local wood. It was designed and constructed here. The only thing that was brought in were the engines, and they brought an engineer in to install the equipment. And some expert boat builder came in to supervise the construction, but it would have been built with local wood. I don't think unlike sailing ships on the sea, where they really specified certain kinds of wood because of the problems of being in salt water and the problems of insect life that existed there that would destroy the wood. We didn't have that kind of problem here. The only problem I think freshwater applies is sort of softening and deteriorating the wood. So that I'm sure local fir would have been and perhaps some cedar, although from everything I've been able to read, cedar was not considered a structural material. It might have been used for cabins and decorative materials and shingles and that sort of thing. But
what's soft?
Yeah, and it doesn't. I guess it doesn't lend itself to very large structures. Because if you were going to have a 3-inch plank of cedar, it wouldn't have the strength to be bent around in the curves that were required, whereas a good piece of fir will stand a lot of tension. And small boats were all built of local cedar. With the wood choice if you're building a rowboat or a canoe. And it wasn't until much later when they had fully developed boat building businesses in Nelson and along the lake that they began importing more exotic woods like yellow cedar from the coast to because of its strength and allowed you to be more water tolerant and then the more exotic woods for finishing than that. But cedar was a very popular wood, finish wood. A lot of the early boats were trimmed with interior with cedar, and certainly homes and that. Cedar was seen as a very effective, pleasant kind of wood. And the range of shades, of course, existed. I'm sure made it popular. Of course, we had American companies up here, and I wanted to sort of just recall that because out of Spokane particularly, a lot of our forest development came. The McGoldrick Lumber Company of Spokane in 1893 established on Kokanee Lake. Interestingly, McGoldrick, his son, ended up being a boat racer and participated in boat races in Nelson. And he was very much aware of the fact that his family had owned and operated sawmills and lumber mills on Kokanee Lake. And so it was sort of a double thing for him to come up and race in Nelson and area races with his outboards, and that when his family had pioneered in the business. McGorick formed his company under the name Royal Lumber Company, and they were busy at Crawford Bay area with a big mill in 1893. So, that was pretty early on. We tend to think, I think today always, that amalgamation and corporate takeover and all this sort of stuff is a modern day phenomenon, and I can assure you it wasn't. A couple of the major sawmills that come to mind in the area were the Patricks, who came out from Quebec as expert sawmill people and established the sawmill at Crescent Valley. And they sold that after they had established and operated for a number of years, became famous as hockey players. The sons came back to Nelson in the summertime to work at the sawmill. The family owned a home in Nelson and operated the sawmill at Crescent Valley. And then some of the Patricks actually played hockey for the Nelson Maple Leaf hockey team. In 1911, the elders, Lester Patrick, decided that the professional hockey was a real coming opportunity. He participated in seeing the Nelson skating rink built up on Hallmines Road, where the Alpine hill is now. Right. And that was a large wooden, huge wooden structure. Looked much like an oversized Quonset hut, but all made of wood. Great arching timbers and beams and bolts. And in 1911, he sold his sawmill at Crescent Valley and its timber rights in the Little Slocan for a cool $1 million. And $1911 million was mind-boggling now. If you had, if you were to probably closer to $20 million in value at least. Then Watts Manufacturing Company had a sawmill at Proctor, and also he was, of course, most famous in East Kokanee. Wattsburg was one of the major sawmill locations in East Kokanee, but he also had the plant at Proctor. He wasn't popular sometimes with people because he hired people from India. It was a very difficult time in the area. Orientals were openly despised. Advertising, no Chinese cooking or no Japanese allowed. All kinds of things that we hope are in the past, and by certainly publicly we don't see those kinds of ads. But that was popular. One of the interesting things was that they were selling and had a plant at Proctor to make wire-wound stave pipe. Now, wire-wound stave pipe meant that you could use it for high-pressure use. So, and it would be tarred. And it would land used in the ground for water distribution, sewer pipe, and all sorts of things. Yeah. And we have a sample of one or two pieces of that wire-wound stave pipe over at the museum. Thinking of amalgamations, in 1906, the Yale Columbia Lumber Company, who were pretty well known to be in the area, the name is quite common in newspaper ads, they moved their headquarters to Nelson. They were operating lumber yards, and I thought that was interesting because they distinguished between sawmills and lumber yards. They weren't necessarily the same thing. You could be in the lumber business and not be in the... You were more of a jobber than you were perhaps, but some of these companies operated both ways. Yeah. So instead of being so-and-so's sawmill company, it would be somebody's lumber company, which did maybe have sawmills, logging operations and that. Anyway, they were a very large group. They had lumber yards at Midway, Greenwood, Phoenix, and the Cusp, and they operated full-out sawmills in Nelson, at Robson, and over in Cascade in the Grand Forks area. Well, the Bowmanville Lumber Company, operating in Revelstoke, was a U.S. company, and they bought out the controlling interest in Yale Company. They had their mills at Revelstoke and Commonplex. So there was amalgamation in 1906 of a very large portion of the Kootenays, West Kootenays, logging production. One of the interesting things that I've become aware of was I went through high school with a fellow whose name was Alan Deschamps, and he was a very interesting fellow, a good athlete, a good chum. He was in Scouts and that when I was, and has retired, and he comes back to holiday up the West Arm pretty well every year, and he was never, in my mind, ever talked about, but his family were big in the sawmill lumbering business in Rossland originally, but also active in this area. Another family that were active here was the Pond family, and they're still members of that family here. They were S.P. Pond was a turn of the century type entrepreneur. He did anything that was likely to turn a buck, but he was an expert in the lumber business. But he also owned a creamery in Nelson. But it seemed typical of him, like he built the creamery up and got its business going well, and then immediately sold it. And he was one of those kind of developer personalities. And of course, there are a couple of families in Nelson that have been, connected with the logging, lumbering business over the years, and the Lamberts are very active in there. The Burns family, I think, in fact, the Burns Lumber Company, which operated up Squirrel Creek, which also operated in the Spokane at Spokane Park, where they had their big sawmill, and I believe they were the first forest license, timber license. I don't know what the correct description is, but it was the first one, I think, issued in British Columbia. In the Spokane area. I think it's the oldest of it. And then there were other people who operated locally. What became Kokanee Forest Products. It was a little sawmill on the waterfront, and went through several enlargements over the years. During that time, they diverted the Anderson Creek from where it used to dump into the corner where the tennis courts are at Lakeside Park, all the way around up to where it goes into the lake now, near where the creamery building, dairy building is down there now. That went through a great many. It was a pole company at one time in which they mostly developed poles, which I presume mostly meant that they got long logs, and then some poor guys spent their days with draw knives taking the skin off, debarking the logs. Poles, of course, were very valuable. I guess they still are in this part of the world. We hang all our electric light and telephone lines on them. One of the small industries, I guess, that existed for some people in Nelson was making clothesline poles and making aerials. Studio became popular in the late 20s and the early 30s.
Okay.
This area, particularly, you needed a good aerial to get any reception.
Right.
And so practically everybody had some sort of a set of aerial poles in their yard.
Yeah.
And of course it was nice because you could just go up the hill here and knock down a couple of jack pine and strip them off and paint them green usually and stand them in the yard and hang a wire between them. They were everywhere. This is sort of one of the things that I remember always. And of course shingle mills. A fellow named Kretschner had a very active shingle mill in Nelson. I'm trying to think of when everything burnt down and he replaced it. Anyway, it was that valuable. What happened was it burnt down in 1910, the original shingle mill, which was on the waterfront here where Cedar Street comes down and crosses the railway tracks, about there. Actually a little to the east of that, but about there. When it burnt down, they replaced it with a shingle mill and box factory. The box factory, of course, was really necessary then because by 1910 there was a big fruit market around here and a lot of boxes necessary for it. And cardboard boxes were still sort of shoebox size. There weren't large cartons still being made out of cardboard. If you wanted to ship something, you had a box made up. And if you wanted to pack fruit and stuff, you had thin-boarded boxes. And the apple industry used them to pack apples. The box factory also made barrels occasionally, not keg barrels, but I don't know if you ever recall seeing a wire barrel to hold nails. You know, it was a very thin sheets of wood on the side, much like apple box side, only longer and tapered to make a barrel shape, and then tied together with stapled wire around it to reinforce it so it would have bursting strength.
Yeah.
And usually a wooden top on bottom reinforced with strap metal. Nails, and kegs of nails, and stuff like that in those kind of barrels, and bigger stuff.
Yeah.
China quite often came in barrels. And if you were shipping stuff by rail, barrels were a common way to ship it, and so they made that sort of stuff.
Right.
I suppose some of the other things I remember, little bits about what would you call it? Like people today are calling themselves wood crafters.
Right.
It's a term. Well, I guess making aerial poles might have entered that area because it was not a formal business. People did it, but usually it was a few people that were known to do it.
Right.
But there were also people who had things called sawbugs. When I was a youngster, there was a lot of people burning wood still and coal, and so to get the winter's supply of wood, a fellow would get an old chassis with an engine on it that still would turn, strip all the vehicle body parts off it, mount a circular saw on the back with a long belt. Belt drive would come off the engine. He'd pull the clutch, disengage the rear wheels, and then put the belt on and turn a circular saw at the back with a swing device on it so you could hold a log, and we'd cut your wood to come up to your cord 2 or 3 or 6 or whatever it was, the wood that you might have in the back alley or wherever you were going to have your wood stored, and saw it up to custom cut to length so that you could split it and use it yourself afterwards. Now, that was a popular thing. The other thing was because we had the W.W. Powell company here who were manufacturing high-grade white pine. A good part of their need was white pine for matchbox. Matchbox were a highly manufactured product. First of all, it required seasoned pine to start with. So they would cut the stuff to large dimensions and air dry it by stacking in the yards. and to make the business viable, because matchbox would be on order, so you produce so many carloads of matchbox and then you'd have to wait for another order. So in order to keep it going, they had a total white pine lumber manufacturing business as well. Of course, for anybody who makes furniture, stuff like that, white pine is one of the nicest woods to work with. So that it was very effective. But in the process of making white pine blocks for matches, they used an end grain, cut it so that all the end grains were on a long block, and then these long 12 or 14 foot long sections of wood would come through the plant, and a bunch of girls would stand there and with a thing that looked sort of like a bush hook, sort of a knife. They would chop out the knotted parts, which couldn't be used, cut into little individual matchsticks at the plant where they would be doing that.
Yeah.
And so all this waste material was cast aside around a belt, and it would be delivered by the truckload or wagon load to houses around town for kindling. Well, it also made marvelous play blocks for kids.
Okay.
It was just marvelous. So we all had huge numbers of beautiful, dry, clean white pine blocks to make toys with, stack them up like for making castles and towers and that. And everybody had snow plows and little cars and all sorts of things made out of matchbox. And then during the Second World War, with the fuel shortage, particularly the expensive coal and stuff being, not that we were short of coal in Canada, but the number of cars that could be dedicated to delivering heating coal, for instance, to an area would be limited.
Right.
And so the use of sawdust became popular for the first time as a substitute, but it required a special feed and burner thing.
Sure.
But most of the greenhouses and a lot of the commercial places converted to using sawdust, which was reasonably cheap and available. And this is not shavings, this is real sawdust. There seems to be a confusion of some people think that shavings, which come from a planing mill, are really sawdust, or else that very fine floury stuff that comes from a furniture manufacturing kind of business, or that kind of thing. But coarse sawdust from a mill is really an effective burning product. And of course, I guess a little thing about wartime, the government did a lot of things to try and give communities a sense of being involved in the war effort. And also at the same time, a lot of communities tried to obtain what they saw as war contracts to keep people busy and working at home. Nelson, they had secured a contract because we had a good manufacturing plant here, a contract to make ammunition boxes, which was a fairly simple thing, but had to be made to dimensional accuracy and properly seasoned. Anyway, the contract was underway, and shortly thereafter, the building burned down. And the offices that were attached to it are still there on Front Street, now used by the freight company as offices and that. But that originally was part of the complex built by H. Green Company, and they had their manufacturing plant behind it, extending right to the railway, where they had access to rail cars, of course, at the back end. And so there was a suggestion that that was sabotage, knowing that how often sawmills and manufacturing plants of that nature burned down was questionable. Right. Then I guess the other uses of raw wood rather than highly manufactured would be things that we had thousands and thousands of pilings around the lake, wharves and that. Plus we had all the enclosures made up of log booms and that around them to hold them together. towing logs on the lake for log booms, floats for practically every boathouse, and there were hundreds of boathouses on the lake, all made of wood. We had cribbing everywhere. The material of choice was wood. And then riprap used everywhere for road building, and corduroy roads in the bush going to mines were pretty common, particularly in valley areas where you run into these sloughly, swampy, slippery side hills that tend to be full of moisture. And then I guess, you see all the trestles that they built in originally. Railway had hundreds of them. They gradually replaced them with rock fields and stuff like that, and the highways had tons of wooden bridges everywhere. So dimensional large timbers were in high demand, and that meant quality wood, because you wouldn't want to risk yourself on something that wasn't first class for that kind of use. So that, and then of course the shingle itself, I guess, was one of the sort of utility tools. Not only did you use it to make a light, safe roof, and in a lot of cases the shingled walls, but shingles were used for all sorts of other things as well. There isn't a carpenter alive who hasn't shimmed up something with the shingle, which is a nice taper that you can always get. As kids, we used to have a lot of toys made of shingles. We used to pond sailing boats out of a simple shingle with a piece stuck in a paper sail. We used to make a kind of an arrow, cut out of it and shot with a single piece of rubber on a stick, something like a slingshot, only instead of having a crotch and that kind of thing, we just have a straight handle with a piece of rubber on it and a loop on the end, and you could fire this shingle, and you'd be amazed how far those would go. And of course we made gliders which wouldn't glide in the sense of you couldn't throw it to glide very far, but if you got up on a cliff you could heave it off and it would perform marvelously. And shingles were a useful thing for that. And of course a lot of people use shingles to start their fires.
Those would have been split, I guess, as opposed to sawn.
Sawn, yeah. So that there were a lot of interesting things with wood. And of course, we talked about split shakes, and I remember in the bush seeing a number of cabins made out of poles, and surprising to me was to see a number of them made with the walls with poles going vertically instead of horizontally. Most of them wouldn't be too great to keep the wind out, but I guess they were animal proof. Large animals couldn't get in, and I think that's probably the real reason they very often in the upper elevations where large timbers weren't available anyway, or the will to try and move that much wood, whereas you could skin a lot of small poles and tie them together vertically. You see those. And of course the mines, aside from the buildings, every mine is timbered to keep the walls and roofs, ceiling from falling in, and the loose rock particularly from coming down. And any size of mine at all developed enough material to come out. They put in a small rail car, even if it was pushed by hand, and so they required ties. And I think the material of choice for ties was tamarack, because it was so pitchy and it stood up good to the being underground and wet. And it was also used for timbering a lot. I think probably also used because it was cheaper. It was that sawmills didn't really want too much. It was not good for lumber.
Tended to
Splinter and be very gummy.
Right. Okay.
A lot of saw problems if you're cutting a lot of that. And then I through my mind go all these pictures of can hooks and peavies and log haulers and grappling chains and all the things, horses, harnesses, You know, when I was a kid, I guess I saw the end of a lot of that. Horses were still in use in the bush, but small tractors and caterpillars were starting to appear. Small loggers were still using quite a few horses. A lot of people were in the contracting. They used their horses for all year round. Some parts of the year they would take maybe have 2 or 3 teams of horses and go in and do somebody's logging. Another time of year they'd be doing plowing, and another time of year they'd be hauling wagons and whatever.
Right.
But they depended upon the forest industry in order to be in business, to stay there. I mean, that was the major reason for having them.
It was a pretty critical resource in the early years then.
Oh yes, yeah. Practically everybody lived in a house that was made of wood. I guess we still do today.
Yes.
But the alternate materials like bricks, we had a couple of big brickyards operating here, but most of the brick went into chimneys and in commercial buildings in the fire zone. Nelson has only 2 or 3 brick buildings built as houses, and yet the bricks were relatively inexpensive, you know. But the material of choice was lumber.
Cool.
You know, I guess one of the things that made this area a little different was the availability of transportation very quickly. Allowed machinery to be brought in,
Right.
so that we developed sawmills and other manufacturing plants to deal with lumber very, very early. And then the railways were in almost on top of that, so that competition became even higher. Yeah, so, you know, I guess for anybody who grew up in Nelson, being aware of how important logging and lumbering and the forest is to us.
Mm-hmm.
Not only, you know, it's our environment. I mean, I don't think I want to live here if all there were mountains of rock.
Right.
The Rockies might be very charming if they're mountains of rock, but right around here, our mountains are of a style that hasn't a great deal of eye appeal until it's covered with a lovely mantle of growing green.
Right.
And gives us that appeal. And you know, we have the wildlife living amongst the trees. The trees maintain a climate for us that's a little better than the average. You know, we have lots of good water up there because we have a covering on the ground. And at the same time, you know, we live in a wooden house and enjoy the comforts of life because we have so much wood. We bring our power lines and our telephone lines and that all march into town on wooden sentries. And everywhere we go, we see we've been able to use the forest.